Chapter 1 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 1, The Man of the Hour. It's positively uncanny. Betty Winter paused on the top step of the Capitol and gazed over the great silent crowd with a shiver. The silence, yes, Ned Vaughn answered slowly. I wondered if you felt it too. It's more like a funeral than an inauguration. The young reporter smiled. You believe General Scott, there may be several funerals in Washington before the day's work is done. And you don't believe him? The girl asked seriously. Nonsense. All this feverish preparation for violence. Betty laughed. I'm afraid you're not a good judge of the needs of the incoming administration. As an avowed secessionist, you're hardly in their confidence. Thank God I'm not. What are those horses doing over there by the trees? Masked battery of artillery. Don't be silly. It's true. Old Scott's going to save the Capitol. On Inauguration Day, anyhow. The avenue's lined with soldiers, sharpshooters posted in the windows along the whole route of the inaugural procession, a company of troops in each end of the Capitol. He has built a wooden tunnel from the street into the north end of the building, and that's lined with guards. A squad of 50 soldiers are under the platform where we're going to sit. No! Look through the cracks and see for yourself, Vaughn cried with scorn. The sparkling brown eyes were focused on the board platform. I do see them moving, she said slowly as a look of deep seriousness swept the fair young face. Perhaps General Scott's right after all. Father says we're walking on a volcano. But not that kind of volcano, Miss Betty, Vaughn interrupted. Senator Winter's an abolitionist. He hates the South with every breath he breathes. Betty nodded. And praise God night and morning to give him greater strength with which to hate it harder, yes. But you're not so blind. There must be a little fire where there's so much smoke. A crazy fool might try to kill the new president. Ned Vaughn's slender figure stiffened. The South won't fight that way. If they begin war, it will be the most solemn act of life. It will be for God and country and what they believe to be right. The Southern people are not assassins. When they take Washington, it will be with the bayonet. And yet your brother had a taste of Southern feeling here the night of the election when a mob broke in and smashed the office of the Republican. Gang of hoodlums, he protested. Anything may happen on election night to an opposition newspaper. The Southern men who formed that mob will never give this administration trouble. I'm so anxious to meet your brother, Betty interrupted. Why doesn't he come? He's in the Senate chamber for the ceremonies. He'll join us before the procession gets here. He's as handsome as everybody says, she asked naively. I'll admit he's a good-looking fellow, if he's my brother. And vain? As a peacock. Conceited? Very. And a woman-hater? Far from it. He's easy. He may not think so, but between us he's an easy mark. I've always been afraid. He'll make a fool of himself and marry without the consent of his younger brother. He's a great care to me. The brown eyes twinkled. You love him very much. Ned Vaughn nodded his dark head slowly. Yes, we've quarreled every day since the election. Over politics? What else? Love, perhaps. The dark eyes met hers. No, he hasn't seen you yet. Betty's laugh was genial and contagious. He had meant to be serious and hoped that she would give him the opening he'd been sparring for, but she refused the challenge. With such amusement, he was picked. You're from Missouri, but you're a true Southerner, Mr. Vaughn, and you're a heartless Puritan, he answered with a frown. She shook her golden brown curls. No, no, no. My name's an accident. My father was born in Maine on the Canada line, but my mother was French. I'm her daughter. I love sunlight and flowers, music and foolishness, and dream of troubadours who sing under my window. I hate long faces and gloom. But my father has ambition. I love him, and so I endure things. Ned Vaughn looked at her timidly. For the life of him, he couldn't make her out. Was she laughing at him? He half suspected it, and yet there was something sweet and appealing. In the way she gazed into his eyes, he gave it up and changed the subject. He had promised to bring John today and introduce him. He'd been prattling like a fool about his older brother. He wished to God now something would keep him. The pangs of jealousy had already begun to gnaw at the thought of her hand resting in his. From the way Betty Winter had laughed, she was quite capable of flying two strings to her bow, and with all the keener interest because they happened to be brothers. Why had she asked him so pointedly about John? He had excited her curiosity, of course, by his silly brother, hero worship. He had told her of his brilliant career in New York under Horace Greeley on the Tribune, of Greeley's personal interest, and the flattering letter he had written to Colonel Forney, which had made him the city editor of the new party organ in Washington, of his cool heroism the night the mob had attacked the Republican office, and last he had hinted of an affair over a woman in New York that had led to a challenge in a bloodless duel, bloodless because his opponent failed to appear. It was his own fault, of course. If Betty was keeping him at arm's length today, no girl could fail to be interested in such a man, no matter who her father might be, Puritan or Cavalier. His arm trembled in spite of his effort at self-control as he led her down the stately steps of the eastern facade towards the inaugural platform. He paused on the edge of the boards and pointed to the huge bronze figure of the Statue of Liberty, which had been cast to crown the dome of the Capitol. It lay prostrate in the mud, and the crowds were climbing over it. "I wonder if Miss Liberty will ever be lifted to her place on high," he said musingly. "If they do finish the dome," Betty replied, "and crown it with that bronze, my father should sue for damages. One of his most eloquent figures of speech will be ruined. That prostrate work of art lying in the mud has given thousands of votes to the Republicans. I've caught myself crying over his eloquence at times myself." Ned Vaughn smiled. "A queer superstition has grown up in Washington that the dome of the Capitol will never be completed. Do you believe it? No, we'll be finished. But I'm not sure whether Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis will preside on that occasion. And I haven't the slightest doubt on that point," Betty said with quick emphasis. I thought you weren't a student of politics," he dryly observed. "I'm not. It's just a feeling. Women know things by intuition," said Betty. The young man glanced upward at the huge crane which swung from the unfinished structure of the dome. "Anyhow, Miss Betty," he said smilingly, "your black Republican president has a beautiful day for the inaugural. We'll hope it's a sign for the future, shall we?" "I hope so," was the serious answer. "God knows there haven't been many happy signs lately. It was dark and threatening at dawn this morning, and a few drops of rain fell up to 8 o'clock. "You were up at dawn?" the girl asked in surprise. "Yes. The Senate has been in session all night over the new amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing to the South security in the possession of their slaves. And they passed it? Yes. Over my father's prostrate form? Yes. An administrative measure, too. I have an idea from the moderation of your father's remarks that there'll be some fun between the White House and the Senate chamber during the next 4 years. For my part, I share his scorn for such 11th-hour repentance. It's too late. The mischief has been done. Secession is a fact, and we've got to face it." "But we haven't heard from the new president yet," Betty ventured. "No. That's why this crowd's so still. For the first time since the foundation of the government, the thousands banked in front of the platform really wish to hear what a president-elect has to say. Isn't that a tremendous tribute to the man? Possibly so, possibly not. He has been silent since his election. Not a word has fallen from his lips to indicate his policy. He has more real power from the moment he takes the oath of office than any crowned head of Europe. From his lips today will fall the word that means peace or war. That's why this crowd's so still." "It's weird," Betty whispered. "You can feel their very hearts beat. Do you suppose that the new president realizes the meaning of such a moment?" "I don't think this one will. I interviewed Stanton, the retiring Attorney General of Buchanan's cabinet, yesterday. He knows Lincoln personally. Was with him in a lawsuit once before the United States court. Stanton says he's a coward and a fool, and the ugliest white man who ever appeared on this planet. He's already christened him the original gorilla, or the Illinois ape." "I wonder," Betty broke in with petulance, "if such a man could be elected president. I'm morbidly curious to see him. My father, as an abolitionist, had to vote for him, and he must support his administration as a Republican senator. But his favorite name for the new chief magistrate is the Illinois Slave Hound. I have a growing feeling that his enemies have overdone their work. I'm going to judge him fairly." Vaughn's lips slightly curved. "They say he's a good stump speaker, a little shy on grammar perhaps, but good on jokes of the coarser kind. He ought to get one or two good guffaws, even out of this sober crowd today." "You think he'll stoop to coarse jokes?" "Of course." "Is that your brother?" Betty asked with a quick intake of breath, lifting her head toward a stalwart figure rapidly coming down the wide marble steps. Ned Vaughn looked up with a frown. "How'd you recognize him?" "By his resemblance to you, of course." "Thanks. You're as much alike as two black-eyed peas, except that you're more slender and boyish, and not so quite as good-looking." A low, mischievous laugh was her answer as John lifted his hat and stood smiling before them. "Miss Winter, this is my brother whose praises I've long been chanting. I've a little work to do in the crowd. I'll be back in a few minutes." There was a touch of irony in the smile with which the younger man spoke as he hurried away, but the girl was too much absorbed in the striking picture John Vaughn made to notice. The sparkling brown eyes took him in from head to foot in a quick, comprehending flash. The fame of his personal appearance was more than justified. He was the most strikingly good-looking man she'd ever seen, and to her surprise there was not the slightest trace of self-consciousness or conceit about him. His high intellectual forehead, thick black hair inclined to curl at the ends, and straight heavy eyebrows suggested at once a man of brains and power. He looked older than he was, at least 30, though he had just turned 26. The square, strong jaw and large chin were eloquent of reserved force. 2 rows of white, perfect teeth smiled behind the black, drooping mustache and invited friendship. The one disquieting feature about him was the look from the depths of his dark brown eyes, so dark that they were black in the shadow. He'd been a dreamer when very young, and followed Charles A. Dana to Brook Farm for a brief stay. Before he had spoken a dozen words, the girl felt the charm of his singular and powerful personality. "I needn't say that I'm glad to see you, Miss Winter," he began with a friendly smile. "Ned has told me so much about you the past month I've made up my mind to join the abolitionists and apply for a secretaryship to the senator, if I couldn't manage it any other way. And you'd be content to resume normal life after today?" She looked into his eyes with mischievous challenge. She had recovered her pose. He laughed, and a shadow suddenly swept his face. "I wonder, Miss Winter, if any of us will live a normal day after today. You've seen the rail splitter, our new president?" "No. I didn't wait in the Senate chamber. I came out here to make sure of my seat beside you." "To hear every word of the inaugural, of course," Betty broke in. "Yes, of course." He paused, and the faintest suggestion of a smile flickered about the corners of his eyes. "Ned told me you had 3 good seats. I'm anxious to hear what he says, but more anxious to see him when he says it. I can read his inaugural, but I want to see the soul of the man behind the conventional phrases." "He'll use conventional phrases? Certainly. They all do. But no man ever came to the presidential chair with as little confidence back of him. The abolitionists have already begun to denounce him before he has taken the oath of office. The rank and file of the party that elected him are not abolitionists and never for a moment believed that the Southern people were in earnest when they threatened secession during the campaign. We thought it was bluff. To say that the whole North and West is panic-stricken is the simple truth. Horace Greeley and the Tribune are for secession. Let our erring sisters go, the editor tells the millions who hang on his words as the oracle of heaven. The North's been talking secession for 30 years, and now the South is doing what they've been threatening. We wake up and try to persuade ourselves that no such right exists in a sovereign state. Yet we all know that Great Britain surrendered to the 13 colonies as sovereign states and named each one of them in our Articles of Surrender and our Treaty of Peace. We know that there never would have been a constitution or a union if the men who drew it and created the union had dared to question the right of either of those sovereign states to withdraw when they wished. They didn't dare to raise the question. They left it for their children to settle. Now we're facing it with a vengeance. Our fathers only dreamed a union. They never lived to see it. The country has always been an aggregation of jangling, discordant, antagonistic sections. How is this man who comes to power today, the humble rail splitter, this country court advocate, to achieve what our greatest statesmen have tried to achieve for nearly 100 years and failed to do? Seward, the man he called to be Secretary of State, has been here 2 months, juggling with his enemies. He's a secessionist at heart and expects the Union to be divided. Surely, Betty interrupted, you can't believe that. It's true. We don't dare say this in our paper, but we know it. So sure is Seward of the collapse of the Lincoln administration that he withdrew his acceptance of the post of Secretary of State only day before yesterday. It's uncertain at this hour whether he'll be in the cabinet. Why? Betty asked in breathless surprise. The young editor was silent a moment and spoke in low tones. You can keep a secret? State secrets easily. Mr. Seward expects to be called to a position of greater power than president. You mean? The dictatorship. That's the talk of the inner circles. Nobody in the North expects war or wants war. Except my father, Betty laughed. The abolitionists don't count. If we have war, there are not enough of them to form a corporal's guard, to say nothing of an army. The North is hopelessly divided and confused. If the South unites, if North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, and Maryland join the Confederacy under Davis, the Union's lost. What's going to hinder them from uniting? They're all slave states. They believe the new president is a black abolitionist Republican. He isn't, of course, but they believe it. How can he reassure them? The states that have already plunged into secession have hauled down the flag from every fort and arsenal, except Sumter and Pickens. The new president can only retake those forts by force. The first shot fired will sweep every slave state out of the Union and arraign the millions of Democratic voters in the North solidly against the government. God pity the man who takes the oath today to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. When John Vaughan's voice died away at last into a passionate whisper, Betty stood looking at him in a spell. She recovered herself with a start and a smile. You've mistaken your calling, Mr. Vaughan, she said with emotion. Why do you say that? You're a statesman, not an editor. You should be in the cabinet. Much obliged, Miss Betty. But I'm not in this one, thank you. Besides, you're mistaken. I'm only an intelligent observer and a reporter of events. I've never had the will to do creative things. Why? The responsibility's too great. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Only God Almighty can save this nation today. It's too much to expect of one man. Yet God must use man, mustn't he? Yes, that's why my soul goes out in sympathy to the lonely figure who steps out of obscurity and poverty today to do this impossible thing. No such responsibility was ever before laid on the shoulders of one man. In all the history of the world, he has no precedent, no guide. Ned interrupted by the flow of John's impassioned speech by suddenly appearing with an uplifted hand. Never such a crowd as this. Why, they say it's smaller than usual, Betty exclaimed. I don't mean size, Ned went on rapidly. It's their temper that's remarkable. An inauguration crowd should support the administration. The Lord help the rail splitter if that sullen, dumb mob are his constituents. Half of them are downright hostile. Washington's a southern town, John remarked. They're not Washington folks, no one in 100. And the only honest backers old Abe seems to have are about 1,000 serious young fellows from the West whom General Scott has armed as a special guard to circle the crowd. He paused and pointed to a group of a dozen Westerners standing beside a bush in the outer rim of the throng. There's a bunch of them, and there's one stationed every 10 yards, the artillery in position, the infantry in line, the sharpshooters massed in windows, the guard under the platform with muskets cocked, and 1,000 volunteers to threaten the crowd from without. I think the new president should get a respectful hearing. The procession is coming up the avenue now with a guard of sappers and miners packed so closely around the open carriage you can't even see the top of old Abe's head. Let's get our seats, Betty cried. They had scarcely taken them when a ripple of excitement swept the crowd as every head was turned toward the aisle that led down the center of the platform. "Oh, it's Mrs. Lincoln and the children and her sisters," Betty exclaimed. "What perfect taste in her dress. She knows how to wear it, too. What a typical plump, self-poised Southern matron looks like. And oh, those darling little boys. Aren't they dears? She's a Kentuckian, too, the irony of fate. A Southerner with a Southern wife, entering the White House, and 8 great Southern states seceding from the Union because of it. It's a funny world, isn't it?" "The South hardly claims Mr. Lincoln as a Southerner," Ned remarked dryly. "Claim it or not, he is," John declared, nodding toward Betty. "As truly a Southerner as Jefferson Davis, they were both born in Kentucky almost on the same day." Another ripple of excitement, and the diplomatic corps entered with measured, stately tread, their gorgeous uniforms flashing in the sun. They took their seats on the left of the canopy. Lord Lyons, the British minister, seated beside the representative of the court of France, 2 men destined to play their parts in the drama of life and death, on whose first act the curtain of history was slowly rising. The black-robed Supreme Court of the Republic in cap and gown slowly followed and took their places on the right, opposite the diplomatic corps. The Marine band struck the first notes of the national hymn amid a silence whose oppressiveness could be felt. The tension of a great fear had gripped the hearts of the crowd with icy fingers. The stoutest soul felt its spell and was powerless to shake it off. Was it the end of the Republic, or the storm-clouded dawn of a new and more wonderful life? God only could tell, and there were few men present who dared to venture a prediction. A wave of subdued excitement rippled the throng, and every eye was focused on the procession from the Senate chamber. "They're coming," Betty whispered excitedly. The contrast between the retiring President James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln was startling even at the distance of the first view of the platform. The man of the old era was heavy and awkward in his movements, far advanced in years, with thin, snow-white hair. His pallid, full face seamed and wrinkled, and his head curiously inclined to the left shoulder. An immense white cravat, like a poultice, pushed his high-standing collar up to the ears. The sharp contrast of the black swallow-tailed coat with the dead white of the cravat, collar, face, and hair suggested the uncanny idea of a moving corpse. With his eyes fixed on Buchanan, John suddenly exclaimed, "A man who's dead and doesn't even know it." Only for a moment did the actual president hold the eye. The man of the hour loomed large at the head of the procession and instantly fixed the attention of every man and woman within the range of vision. His giant figure seemed to tower more than a foot above his surroundings. Everything about him was large, an immense head crowned with a thick shock of coarse black hair, his strong jaws rimmed with bristling new whiskers, long arms and longer legs, large hands, big features, every movement quick and powerful. The first impression was one of enormous strength. He looked every inch the stalwart backwoods athlete, capable of all the feats of physical strength campaign stories had credited to his record. One glance at his magnificent frame, and no one doubted the boast of his admirers that he could lift 1,000 pounds, 500 in each hand, or bend an iron poker by striking it across the muscle of his arm. As he reached the speaker's stand beneath the crowded canopy, there was an instant's awkward pause. In his new immaculate dress suit, with black satin vest, shining silk hat, and gold-headed cane, he seemed a little ill at ease. He looked in vain for a place to put his hat and cane, finally found a corner of the railing against which to lean the stick, but there seemed no place left for the new hat. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, his defeated Northern opponent for president, with a friendly smile took it from his hand. As Douglas slipped gracefully back to his seat, he whispered to the lady beside him, "If I can't be president, at least I can hold his hat." The simple but significant act of courtesy from the great leader of the Northern Democrats was not lost on the new chief magistrate. He could hardly believe what his eyes had seen at first. And then he smiled. Instantly the rugged features were transformed, and his whole being was lighted with a strange soft radiance whose warmth was contagious. Betty's eyes were dancing with excitement. "He's not ugly at all," she whispered. Ned softly laughed. "He certainly is not a beauty." "Who expects beauty in a real man?" she answered with a touch of scorn, and Ned shot a look of inquiry at John's handsome face. But the older brother was too intent on the drama before him to notice. The editor's eyes were riveted on the new president, studying every detail of his impressive personality. He'd never seen him before and was trying to form a just and accurate judgment of his character. Beyond a doubt he was big physically. This impression was overwhelming, everything large. The head with its high crown of skull and thick bushy hair, deep cavernous eyes, heavy eyebrows which moved in quick sympathy with every emotion, large nose, large ears, large mouth, large thick under lip, very high cheekbones, massive jawbones with upturned chin, a sinewy long neck, long arms and large hands, long legs and big feet. A giant physically, and yet somehow he gave the impression of excessive gauntness, and about his face there dwelt a strange impression of sadness, spiritual anguish. The hollowness of his cheeks, accented by his swarthy complexion, emphasized this. The crowd had recognized him instantly, but without the slightest pause. The silence was intense, oppressive, painful. John glanced up and saw the huge figure of Senator Wigfall of Texas, looking down on the scene from the base of one of the white columns of the central facade. He waved his arm defiantly and laughed. His presence in the Senate, after all his associates had withdrawn, was the subject of keen speculation. He was believed to be a spy of the Confederate government. He had asked General Scott, half in jest, if he would dare to arrest a senator of the United States for treason. The answer was significant of the times. Looking the senator straight in the eye, the old hero slowly said, "No, I'd blow him to hell." Evidently the senator was not as yet unduly alarmed. His expression of triumphant contempt for the evident lack of enthusiasm could not be mistaken. When John Vaughan recalled the confusion in the ranks of the triumphant party, he knew the senator's scorn would be redoubled if he but knew half the truth. Again he turned towards a tall, lonely man with sinking heart. The ceremony moved swiftly. The silence was too oppressive to admit delay. Senator Baker of Oregon, the warm personal friend of Lincoln, stepped quickly to the edge of the platform. With hand outstretched, in an easy, graceful gesture, he said, "Fellow citizens, I introduce you to Abraham Lincoln, the President-elect of the United States of America." Again the silence of death, as the once ragged, lonely, barefoot boy from a Kentucky cabin stepped forward into the fiercest light that ever beat on a human head. He quickly adjusted his glasses, drew his tall figure to full height, and began to read his address. His face suddenly radiant with the poise of conscious, reserved power, oblivious of crowd, ceremony, hostility, or friendship. His voice was strong, high-pitched, clear, ringing, and his articulation singularly and beautifully perfect. His words carried to the outer edge of the vast silent throng. Betty watched his mobile features with increasing fascination. His bushy eyebrows and the muscles of his sensitive face moved and flashed in sympathy with every emotion. A countenance of such large and rugged lines, every movement spoke unusual power. The lift of an eyebrow, the curve of a lip, the flash of the eye were gestures more eloquent than the impassioned sweep of the ordinary orator's arm. He made no gesture with his hand or arm of the mass of his towering body. No portrait of this man had ever been made. She'd seen many pictures, and not one of them had suggested the deep, subtle, indirect expression of his face, something that seemed to link him with the big forces of nature. The crowd was feeling this now, and men were leaning forward from their seats on the platform. The venerable Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, whose clear, accurate, and mercilessly logical decision on slavery had created the storm which swept Lincoln into power, was watching him with bated breath, and not for an instant during the inaugural address did he lower his somber eyes from the face of the speaker. John C. Breckinridge, the retiring vice president, his defeated opponent from the southern states, the proud Kentucky Chevalier was listening with keen and painful intensity, his handsome, cultured features pale with the consciousness of coming tragedy. His opening words had been reassuring to the South, but woke no responses from the silent thousands who stood before him as he went on. I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. The simplicity, directness, and clearness of this statement could find no parallel in the pompous words of his predecessors. The man was talking in the language of the people. It was something new under the sun. And then, with the clear ring of a trumpet, each syllable falling clean-cut and sharp, with marvelous distinctness, he continued, I hold that the union of these states is perpetual. He paused for an instant, his voice suddenly failing from deep emotion. And then, if stung by a silence with which this thrilling thought was received, he uttered the only words not written in his manuscript, and he made the only gesture of his entire address. His great fist came down with a resounding smash on the table, and the tones heard by the last man who hung on the edge of the throng. He said, No state has the right to secede. And still no cheer from the strangely silent crowd. Only a vague shiver swept from the hearts of the Southern people before him. If the North loved the Union, they were giving no tokens to the tall, lonely figure on that platform. And last, the sentences, big with the fate of millions, were slowly and tenderly spoken. I shall take care that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. Doing this, I deem it to be a simple duty on my part, and I shall perform it. At last he touched the Hidden Power magazine with an electric spark, and a cheer swept the crowd. It died away at last, rose with new power, and rose a third time before it subsided, and a clear voice went on. I trust this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as the declared purpose of the Union, that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. In doing this, there needs be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided in me will be used to hold and occupy and possess the property and places belonging to the government. Again the powder mine exploded, and a cheer rose. The grim walls of Fort Sumter and Pickens and far-off southern waters flashed red before every eye. The applause suddenly died away in the old silence, and a man in the crowd before the platform yelled, We're for Jefferson Davis. There was no answer and no disorder, only the shrill cry of the Southerner through the silence, and the speaker continued his address. Senator Douglas looked uneasily over the crowd toward the spot from whence the cry came, his brow wrinkled with a frown. John Vaughan leaned towards Betty and whispered half to himself, I wonder if these cheers were defiance after all. But the girl was too intent on the words of the speaker to notice. His next sentence brought a smile and a nod of approval from Senator Douglas. But beyond what may be necessary for those objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. Again and again Douglas nodded his approval, spoke it in low tones. Good, good, that means no coercion. And then followed in solemn tones the faithful sentences. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you unless you first assail it. You can have no conflict without yourselves being aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. You can forbear the assault upon it. I cannot shrink from the defense of it. Again he paused, and the crowd hung spellbound as he bent his closing paragraph in tendered, persuasive accents, throbbing with emotion, his clear voice breaking for the first time. I am loath to close. We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The closing words fell from his sensitive lips, with the sad, dreamy eyes blinded by tears. At last he had touched the hearts of all. The sincerity and beauty of the simple appeal for the moment hushed bitterness and passion, and the cheer was universal. The black-robed figure of the venerable Chief Justice stepped forward with extended open Bible. His bony, trembling fingers and cadaverous intellectual face gave the last touch of dramatic contrast between the old and new regimes. The tall, dark man reverently laid his left hand on the open book, raised his right arm, and slowly repeated the words of the oath. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. The words had scarcely died on his lips when the distant boom of cannon proclaimed the new president. The crowd on the platform rose and stood with uncovered heads, while the procession formed in the same order as at its entrance and return to the White House. "What do you think of it?" Betty asked breathlessly, turning to Ned. The firm young lips came together with sudden passion. "The argument is ended. To your tents, O Israel. It means war." "Nonsense," John broke in impetuously. "It means anything or nothing. It's hot and cold, a straddle, a contradiction." He paused and turned to Betty. "What do you think?" "Of the president?" she asked dreamily. Of his inaugural," John corrected. "I don't know whether it means peace or war, not being a statesman, but of one thing I'm sure, yes, that a great man has appeared on the scene." Both men laughed, and she went on with deep earnestness. "I mean it. He's splendid. He's wonderful. He's a poet, a dreamer, and so typically Southern, Mr. Ned Vaughn. I could easily picture him fighting a duel over a fine point of honor as he did once. He's patient, careful, wise, cautious, very tender, and very strong. To me, he's inspired." Again, both men laughed. "I honestly believe that God has sent him into the kingdom for such a time as this." "You get that impression from his rambling address, with its obvious effort to straddle the universe?" John asked incredulously. "Not from what he said," Betty persisted, "so much as the way he said it, though I got the very clear idea that his purpose is to save the Union. He made that thought ring through my mind over all others." "You really like him?" Ned asked with a cold smile. "I love him," was the eager answer. "He's adorable. He's genuine. Man of the people. We've had many presidents who wore purple and fine linen and professed democracy. Now we've got the real thing. I wonder if they'll crucify him." All through his address I could see the little ragged forlorn boy standing beside his mother's grave, crying his heart out in despair and loneliness. He's wonderful. And he's not overawed by these big pillars above us either. The man who tries to set up for a dictator while he's in the White House will find trouble. The two leading men he has called into his cabinet, John broke in musingly, hold him in contempt. "There's a surprise in store for Mr. Seward and Mr. Chase," Betty ventured. "I'm afraid your father will not agree with you, Miss Betty." Ned laughed, glancing towards Senator Winter. "I foresee trouble for you." "No danger. My father never quarrels with me over politics. He just pities my ignorance and lets it go at that. He never condescends to my level." She stopped suddenly and waved her hand towards the group of excited men who had gathered around Senator Winter. A smile of recognition lighted the somber Puritan face as he pushed his friends aside and rapidly approached. "How's my little girl?" he cried tenderly. "Enjoy the show?" "Yes, dear, immensely. You know Mr. John Vaughn, Father, don't you?" The old man smiled grimly as he extended his hand. "I know who he is, though I haven't had the honor of an introduction. I'm glad to see you, Mr. Vaughn, though I don't always agree with many of your editorials. We'll hope for better things in the future, Senator, John laughed. What's your impression of the inaugural, Senator? Ned asked with a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. You are asking me that as a reporter, young man, or as a friend of my daughter? Both, sir. Then I'll give you 2 answers, one for the public and one for you. I've an idea you're going to be a rebel, sir. We hope not, Senator, John protested. I've my suspicions from an interview we had once, but you're a good reporter, sir. I trust your ability and honesty, however deeply I suspect your patriotism. As a Republican senator, I say to you for publication, the president couldn't well have said less. It might have been unwise to say more. To you, as a budding young rebel and a friend of my daughter, I say with the utmost frankness that I have no power to express my contempt for that address. From the lips of the man we elected to strangle slavery fell the cowardly words, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. The grim blue-gray eyes flashed with rage. He paused for breath and then, livid with suppressed emotion, continued, For 50 years, every man who has stood on this platform to take the oath as president has turned his face to the South and bowed the knee to Baal. We hoped for better things today. He paused a moment, and his eyes filled with angry tears. How long, O Lord, how long? But you mustn't forget, Senator, that he didn't run and we didn't win on an abolitionist platform. We only raised the issue of the extension of slavery into the new territories. Yes, the old man sneered, but you didn't fool the South. They are past masters in the art of politics. The South is seceding because they know that the Republican Party was organized to destroy slavery, and that its triumph is a challenge to a life-and-death fight on that issue. It's a waste of time to beat the devil round the stump. We've got to face it. I hate a trimmer and a coward, but don't you dare print that for a while, young man. Hardly, sir, Ned answered with a smile. I've got to support my own administration for a few days at least, and then, well, we won't cross any bridges till we come to them. He stopped abruptly and turned to John. Come to see us, Mr. Vaughn. Your paper should be a power before the end of the coming 4 years. I know Forney, your chief. I'd like to know you better. Thank you, Senator, the young editor replied cordially. Can't you dine with us tomorrow night, Mr. Vaughn? Betty asked unconsciously, bending toward his straight, well-poised figure. Ned observed her with a frown and heard John's answer in a sudden surge of anger. Certainly, Miss Betty, with pleasure. To Ned's certain knowledge, it was the first invitation of the kind he had accepted since his advent in Washington. Again he cursed himself for a fool for introducing them. Betty beamed her friendliest look straight into his eyes and softly said, You'll come, of course, Mr. Ned. For the life of him, he couldn't get back his conventional tones for an answer. His voice trembled in spite of his effort. Thank you, he said slowly. It will not be possible. I have an assignment at the White House for that evening. He turned abruptly and left them. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 2, Jangling Voices. The roar of the inauguration passed, and Washington was itself again, an old-fashioned southern town of 60,000 inhabitants. No longer asleep, perhaps, but still aristocratic, skeptical, sneering in its attitude toward the new administration. Behind the scenes in his cabinet reigned confusion incredible. The tall, dark backwoodsman who presided over these wrangling giants appeared at first, to their superior wisdom, a dazed spectator. He had called them because they were indispensable. Now that the issues were to be faced, Mr. Seward, Mr. Chase, Mr. Cameron, and Mr. Bates realized that the country lawyer who had won the presidency over their superior claims knew his weakness and relied on their strength, training, and long experience in public affairs. Certainly it had not occurred to one of them that his act in calling the greatest men of his party, and the party of opposition as well, into his cabinet was a deed of such intellectual audacity that it scarcely had a parallel in history. Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State, had reluctantly consented to enter the cabinet at the last moment as an act of patriotism to save the country from impending ruin too great for any other man to face. His attitude was a reasonable one. He was the undoubted leader of the triumphant party. Without a moment's hesitation, on the first day of his service as Secretary of State, he assumed the position of a Prime Minister, whose duties included a general supervision of all departments of government, as well as a regent's supervision over the executive. Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, at once took up the gauntlet thrown down by his rival. He not only regarded the president with contempt, but he extended it to the political trickster who had dared to assume the airs of premiership in a democratic republic. To these cabinet meetings came no voices of comfort from the country. The abolitionist press, which represented the aggressive conscience of the North, continued to ridicule and denounce the inaugural address in unmeasured terms. The simple truth was soon apparent to the somber eyes of the president. He was facing the gravest problem that ever confronted a statesman, without an organized party on which he could depend for support. But two members of the cabinet had any confidence in his ability or genuine loyalty: Gideon Welles, a Northern Democrat, and Montgomery Blair, a Southern aristocrat. The problem before him was bigger than faction, bigger than party, bigger than slavery. Could a government founded upon the genuine principles of democracy live? Could such a union be held together, composed of warring sections with vast territories extending over thousands of miles, washed by two oceans, extending from the frozen mountains of Canada to the endless summers of the tropics? If the Southern people should unite in a slaveholding confederacy, it was not only a question as to whether he could shape an army mighty enough to conquer them. The more urgent and by far the graver problem was whether he could mold into unity the warring factions of the turbulent, passion-torn North. These people had elected him. Could he ever hope to bind them into a solid fighting unit? If their representatives in his cabinet were truly representatives, the task was beyond human power. And yet the tall, lonely figure calmly faced it without a tremor. In the depths of his cavernous eyes there burned a steady flame, but few of the men about him saw or understood it, if they saw. That flame was something new in the history of the race, a faith in the common man, which dared to give a new valuation to the individual and set new standards for the democracy of the world. He believed that the heart of the masses of the people, north, south, east, and west, was sound at the core, and that as their chief magistrate, he could ultimately appeal to them over the heads of all traditions, all factions, and accepted leaders. He was the most advised man and the worst advised man in history. It became necessary to think for himself or cease to think at all. General Scott, the venerable hero of Lundy Lane, in command of the army, had suggested as a solution of the turmoil the division of the country into 4 separate confederacies, and had roughly drawn their outlines. Horace Greeley had made the Tribune the most powerful newspaper in the history of America. The Republicans thought the country had been educated by its teachings and held its authority second only to the Word of God. And yet, from the moment of Lincoln's election, the chief occupation of this powerful paper was to criticize and condemn the measures and policies of the president. Over and over, Horace Greeley repeated the deadly advice to the nation. If the Cotton States shall decide that they can do better out of the Union than in it, We insist on letting them go in peace. Greeley serenely insisted, if 8 southern states, having 5 million of people, choose to separate from us, they cannot be permanently withheld from doing so by federal canon. The South has as good right to secede from the Union as the colonies had to secede from Great Britain. If they choose to form an independent nation, they have a clear moral right to do so, and we will do our best to forward their views. Is it to be wondered at that the Southern people were absolutely clear in their conception of the right to secede, if such doctrines were taught in the North by the highest authority within the party which had elected Abraham Lincoln? If Lincoln's own party leaders were boldly proclaiming such treason to the Union, how could he hope to stem the tide that had set in for its ruin? The thousands of conservative men, North and South, who had voted for the constitutional Union ticket of John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts, demanded peace at any price. An orator in New York, at a great mass meeting, dared to say, if a revolution of force is to begin, it shall be inaugurated at home. It will be just as brutal to send men to butcher our brothers in the South as it will be to massacre them in the northern states. The business interests of the northern cities were bitterly and unanimously arrayed against any attempt to use force against the South. The city of New York was thoroughly imbued with secession sentiment, and its mayor, through Daniel E. Sickles, one of its members of Congress, demanded the establishment of a free and independent municipal state on the island of Manhattan. Seward had just written to Charles Francis Adams, our minister to England. Only an impartial and despotic government could subjugate thoroughly disaffected and insurrectionary members of the state. The federal republican country of ours is, of all forms of government, the very one which is the most unified for such a labor. This letter could only mean one of two things. Either that the first member of the cabinet was a secessionist and meant to allow the South to go unmolested, or he planned to change our form of government by a coup d'etat in the crisis and assume the dictatorship. In either event, his attitude boded ill for the new president and his future. Wendell Phillips, the eloquent friend of Senator Winter, declared in Boston in a public address, "Here are a series of states who think that their peculiar institution require that they should have a separate government. They have the right to decide that question without appealing to you or me. Standing with the principle of 76 behind us, who can deny them their right? Abraham Lincoln has no right to a soldier in Fort Sumter. There is no longer a union. You cannot go through Massachusetts and recruit men to bombard Charleston and New Orleans. Nothing but madness can provoke a war with the Gulf states." The last member of his distracted, divided, passion-ridden cabinet had gone at the close of its first eventful sitting. The dark figure of the president stood beside the window, looking over the mirror-like surface of the Potomac at the hills of Virginia. The shadow of a great sorrow shrouded his face and form. The shoulders drooped, but the light in the depths of his somber eyes was growing steadily in intensity. Old Edward, the veteran hallman, appeared at the door with his endless effort to wash his hands without water. "A young man wishes to speak to you, sir. A reporter, I think, Mr. Ned Vaughn of the Daily Republican." Without lifting his eyes from the Virginia hills, the quiet voice said, "Let him in." In vain the wily diplomat of the press thought to obtain a declaration of policy on the question of Fort Sumter. In his easy, friendly way, the president made him welcome, but only smiled and slowly shook his head in answer to each pointed question, or laughed aloud at the skillful traps he was invited to enter. "It's no use, my boy," he said at last with a weary gesture. "I'm not going to tell you anything today." He paused, and the light suddenly flashed from beneath his shaggy brows. "Except this. You can say to your readers that my course is as plain as a turnpike road. It's marked out by the Constitution. I am in no doubt which way to go. I'm going to try to save the Union." "In short," Ned laughed, You propose to stand by your inaugural. That's a pretty good guess, young man. I'm surprised that you paid such close attention to my address. Perhaps I had an interpreter. Did you? Yes. Who? Very beautiful young woman, Mr. President, Ned answered serenely. The hazel gray eyes twinkled. What's her name, sir? Miss Betty Winter. Not the daughter of that old grizzly bear who's always camping on my trail? Same, sir. The swarthy face lighted with a radiant smile. What did she say about my inaugural? That it was the utterance of a wise, patient, great man. Two big hands suddenly closed on Ned's, and the tall figure bent low. Thank you for telling me that, my boy. It helps me after a hard day. She said many other things, too, Ned added. Did she? With enthusiasm. Tell her to come to me, the president said slowly. I want to talk to her. He paused, turned to his desk, and seized a pen. I'll send a subpoena for her. That's better. One of his cards, he quickly wrote. My dear Miss Winter, you are hereby summoned to immediately appear before the Chief Magistrate to testify concerning grave matters of state. A. Lincoln. He slipped his long arm around Ned's shoulder and walked with him to the door. Serve that honor for me, will you? Right away. With a nod and a smile, the reporter bowed and turned his steps toward the senator's house. Chapter 3 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 3, In Betty's Garden. Ned Vaughn paused with a moment of indecision before the plain old-fashioned brick house in which Senator Winter lived on the Capitol Hill. It was a confession of abject weakness to decline her invitation to dinner with his brother and jump at the first chance to butt in before the dinner hour. Why should he worry? She was too serious and honest to play with any man, to say nothing of an attempt to flirt with two at the same time. He refused to believe in the seriousness of any impression she had made on his brother's conceited fancy. His light love affairs had become notorious in his set. He was only amusing himself with Betty, and she was too simple and pure to understand. Yet to warn her at this stage of the game against his own brother was obviously impossible. He suddenly turned on his heel. I'm a fool. I'll wait till tomorrow. He walked rapidly to the corner, stopped abruptly, turned back to the door, and rang the bell. Anyhow, I'm not a coward. The pretty Irish maid who opened the door smiled graciously and knowingly. It made him furious. She mistook his rage for blushes. The maid giggled insinuatingly. Miss Betty's in the garden, sir. She said to come right out there. What? Yes, sir. She saw you come to the door just now and told me to tell you. Again the girl giggled, and again he flushed with rage. He found her in the garden, busy with her flowers. The border of the tall jonquils were in full bloom. Gorgeous yellow flame leaped from both sides of the narrow walkway, whose circled the high brick wall covered with a mass of honeysuckle. She held a huge pair of pruning shears, clipping the honeysuckle away from the budding violet beds. She lifted her laughing brown eyes to his. Do help me, she cried. This honeysuckle vine is going to cover the whole garden and smother the house, I'm afraid. He took the shears from her pink fingers and felt the thrill of their touch for just a moment. His eyes lingered on the beautiful picture she had made with her flushed face and tangled ringlets of golden brown hair falling over her forehead and cheeks and white rounded throat. The blue gingham apron was infinitely more becoming than the most elaborate ball costume. It suggested home and the sweet intimacy of comradeship. You're lovely in that blue apron, Miss Betty, he said with earnestness. Then I'm forgiven for making home folks of you. I'm very happy of it. Well, you see, I had no choice, she hastened to add. I just had to finish these flowers before dressing for dinner. I'm expecting that handsome brother of yours directly, and I must look my best for him. Now mustn't I? She smiled into his eyes with such charming audacity he had to laugh. Of course you must, he agreed, and bent quickly to the task of clearing her violet bed of entangled vines. In 10 minutes, his strong hand had done the work of an hour for her slender fingers. How swiftly and beautifully you work, Ned, she exclaimed as he rose with face flushed and gazed. A moment, admiringly, on the witchery of her exquisite figure. How'd you like me for a steady gardener? I hope you're not going to lose your job on your brother's paper. It's possible. Why? We don't agree on politics. A reporter don't have to agree with an editor. He only obeys orders. That's it, Ned answered with a firm snap of his strong jaw. I'm not going to take orders from this government many more days. From the present outlook. Betty looked him straight in the eye in silence and slowly asked, You're not really going to join the rebels? The slender boyish figure suddenly straightened and his lips quivered. Perhaps. You can't mean it, she cried incredulously. Would you care? He asked slowly. Very much, was the quick answer. I should be shocked and disappointed in you. I never believed for a moment that you meant what you said. I thought you were only debating the question from the southern side. Tell me, Ned broke in. Does your father mean half he says about Lincoln and the South? Every word he says. My father is made of the stuff that kindles martyrs' fires. He will march to the stake for his principles when the time comes. You admire that kind of man, don't you? Yes, and for that reason I can't understand why you admire a trimmer and a time server. You mean? The rail splitter in the White House. But he's not, Betty protested. I can feel the hand of steel beneath his glove. Wait and see, Ned laughed. Let Ephraim alone. He's joined to his idols. As our old preacher used to say back in Missouri, your decision is hopeless. It's well the president is safely married. Betty's eyes twinkled. Ned paused, blushed, fumbled in his pocket, and drew out the card the president had given him to deliver. I'm ordered by the administration, he gravely continued, to serve this document on the daughter of Senator Winter. Betty's eyes danced with amazement as she read the message in the hand of the chief magistrate. He sent this to me? Ordered me to serve it on you at once, my excuse for coming at this unseemly hour. But why? I gave him a hint of your opinion of his inaugural. I think it's a case of a drowning man grasping a straw. Well, this is splendid, she exclaimed. You take it seriously? It's a great honor. And you are going? I'm going tonight if it were possible. Tomorrow, sure. She looked at the card curiously. I have a strange presentiment that something wonderful will come of this meeting. No doubt of it. No doubt of it. When Senator Winter's daughter becomes the champion of the slave hound of Illinois, there'll be a sensation in the capital, gossip to say nothing of what may happen at home. I'll risk what happens at home, Ned. My father has two great passions, the hatred of slavery and the love of his frivolous daughter. I can twist him around my little finger. She paused, snapped her finger, and smiled into his face sweetly. Do you doubt it, sir? No. He answered with a frown, dropping his voice to low, tender tones. But would you mind telling me, Miss Betty, why you called me Mr. Ned the other day when I introduced you to John? The faintest tinge of red flashed in her cheeks. I must have done it unconsciously. Please don't do it again. It hurts. You've called me Ned too long to drop it now, don't you think? Yes. Her eyes twinkled with mischief as she took his hand in parting. Goodbye, Ned, she breathed softly. And then he did a foolish thing, but the impulse was resistless. He bent low, reverently kissed the tips of her fingers, and fled without daring to look back. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 4, A Pair of Young Eyes. When Betty's card was sent in at the White House the next morning, a smile lighted the somber face of the president. He waved his long arms impulsively to his secretaries and the waiting crowd of congressmen. Clear everybody out for a few minutes, boys. I have an appointment at this hour. The tall figure bowed with courtly deference over the little hand, and his voice was touched with deep feeling. I want to thank you personally, Miss Betty, for your kind words about my inaugural. They helped and cheered me in a trying moment. I'm glad, was the smiling answer. Tell me everything you said about it, he urged laughingly. I'm afraid Mrs. Lincoln might not like it, she said demurely. We'll risk it. I'm going to take you in to see her in a minute. I want her to know you. Tell me, what else did you say?" He spoke with the eager wistfulness of a boy. It was only too plain that few messages of good cheer had come to lighten the burden his responsibilities had brought. A smile touched her eyes with tender sympathy. "You won't be vain if I tell you exactly what I said, Mr. President. After all the brickbats that have been coming my way, no man could laugh with more genuine, hearty enjoyment. His laughter convulsed his whole being for the moment, fairly hypnotized his hearer into sympathy with his mood. Out with it, Miss Betty. I need it," he urged. "I said, Mr. President, that you were very tender and very strong." She paused and looked straight into his deep-set eyes, and that a great man had appeared in our history. He was still for a moment, and a mist veiled the light at which she gazed. He took her hand in both of his, pressed it gently, and murmured, "Thank you, Miss Betty. I shall try to prove worthy of my little champion." "I think you do things without trying, Mr. President," she answered. "And you don't want an office, do you?" "No." "You have no favors to ask for your friends, have you?" "None whatever." "And you're Senator Winter's daughter?" "Yes." "The old grizzly bear. He hates me, but I've always liked him." "I hope you'll always like him," Betty broke in. "Of course I will. I've never cherished resentments. Life's too short, and the office I fill is too big for that. Do you know why I've sent for you?" Betty smiled. "To have me flatter you, of course. All men are vain. The greater the man, the greater his vanity." Again he laughed with every muscle of his face and body. "Honestly, no, that's not the reason," he said confidently. "I want you to accept a position in my cabinet." "I didn't know that women were admitted." "They're not, but I've always been in favor of votes for women, and I'm going to make a place for you." Betty's lips trembled with a smile. "What's the salary?" "No salary. Save eternal gratitude to your chief. Will you accept?" "I'll consider it. What duty?" He looked steadily into her brown eyes. "You have very bright, clear eyes, Miss Betty. I can see myself in them now more distinctly than in that mirror over the mantel. I'd like to borrow your eyes now and then to see things with. Will you accept the position?" "If I can be of service, yes." "The White House is open to you at all hours, and I shall send for you sometimes when I'm blue. I'm puzzled, and I want a pair of pure, beautiful young eyes. You understand?" Betty extended her hand, and her voice trembled. "You have conferred on me a very great honor, Mr. President." "For instance, now," he said dreamily, "you endorsed my inaugural?" "I'm sure it was wise, firm, friendly, and dignified." "I couldn't have said less that I must possess and hold the property of the government, could I? Well, I must now order a fleet to sail for Charleston Harbor, to relieve our fort, or allow the men who wear our uniform and fly our flag to die of starvation or surrender. Pretty poor commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy if I do that, am I not? Suppose I send a fleet to provision our men in Fort Sumter. Not reinforce it, mind you, merely provisions for the handful of men who are there. And suppose the Southern troops manning those land batteries open fire on our flag and force Major Anderson to surrender. What would happen in the North?" He paused and looked at her steadily. The fine young figure suddenly stiffened. "Every man, woman, and child would say fight." The big jaws came together with firm precision, and his huge fist struck the table. "That's what I think. And at the same time, something else would be happening over there." His long arm swept toward the hills of Virginia, dark and threatening on the horizon. "The moment that shot crashes against our fort, North Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee will join the Confederacy, to say nothing of what may happen in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, all slave states. The shock will be felt on both sides, with precisely opposite effects. Sometimes we must do our duty and leave the rest to God, mustn't we?" "Yes, of course. We must, and now I've kept you too long, Miss Betty. It's a bargain, isn't it? You accept the position in my cabinet?" "Of course, Mr. President. But if my duties are no heavier than I find them on this occasion, I feel I shall be of little help. You've been a great service to me. You've confirmed my decision on a great problem state. Come now and see Mother and the children. I want you to know them and like them." He led her quickly into the family apartment and introduced her to Mrs. Lincoln. He found her in a midst of a grave discussion with Lizzie Garland, her colored dressmaker. "This is old Grizzly's lovely daughter, Miss Betty Winter, Mother. She has joined the administration, stands squarely with us against the world, flesh the devil, and her father. I told her you'd give her the keys to the house." With a wave of a big hand, he was gone. Mrs. Lincoln's greeting was simple and hearty. In half an hour, Betty found a place in her heart for life. The boys were claiming her as their own, and a train of influences were set in motion, destined to make history. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The First Shot. The first month of the new administration passed in a strange peace that proved to be the calm before the storm. On the first day of April, All Fool's Day, Mr. Seward decided to bring to a definite issue the question of supreme authority in the government. That Abraham Lincoln was the nominal president was true, of course. Mr. Seward generously decided to allow him to remain nominally at the head of the nation and assume himself the full responsibilities of a dictatorship. The Secretary of State strolled leisurely into the executive office, more careless in dress than usual, the knot of his cravat under his left ear, a huge lighted cigar in his hand. He handed the president a folded sheet of official paper, bowed carelessly, and retired. He had drawn up his proclamation under the title, "Some Thoughts for the President's Consideration." In this document, he proposed to assume the dictatorship and outlined his policy as director of the nation's affairs. He would immediately provoke war with Great Britain, Russia, Spain, and France. The dark-visaged giant adjusted his glasses and read the paper with a smile of incredulous amazement. He wiped his glasses and read it again. And then, without consultation with a single human being and without a moment's hesitation, he wrote a brief reply to the great man and his generous offer. There was no bluster, no wrath, no demand for an apology to his insulted dignity, but in the simplest and friendliest and most direct language he informed his secretary that if a dictator were needed to save the country, he would undertake the dangerous and difficult job himself, inasmuch as he had been called by the people to be their commander-in-chief, and that he expected their cooperation, advice, and support of all the members of his cabinet. He did not even refer to the wild scheme of plunging the country into war with two-thirds of the civilized world. The bare announcement of such a suggestion would have driven the secretary from public life. The quiet man who presided over the turbulent cabinet never hinted to one of its members that such a document had reached his hands. But as shades of night fell over the Capitol on that first day of April, 1861, there was one distinguished statesman within the city who knew that a real man had been elected president and that he was going to wield power placed in his hands without a tremor of fear or an instant hesitation. It took many months for other members of his cabinet to learn this, but there was no more trouble with his Secretary of State. He became at once his loyal, earnest, and faithful counselor. On April 6th, the fleet was sent to sea under sealed orders to relieve Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The president had been loath to commit the act which must inevitably provoke war, unless the whole movement of secession in the South was one political bluff. The highest military authority of the country had advised him that the fort could not be held by any force at present visible, and that its evacuation was inevitable in any event. His cabinet, with two exceptions, were against any attempt to relieve it. The sentiment of the people of the North was bitterly opposed to war on the South. On April 7th, the fleet was at sea, on its way to the southern coast, its guns shotted, its great battle flags streaming in the wind. In accordance with the amenities of war, the president notified General Beauregard, commander of Southern forces in Charleston Harbor, that he had sent his fleet to put provisions into Sumter, but not at present to put in men, arms, or ammunition, unless the fort should be attacked. On the night this message was dispatched, Roger A. Pryor of Virginia made a speech in Charleston from the balcony of Mills Hotel to practically the entire white population of the city. Its message was fierce, direct, electric. It was summed up in a single sentence. Strike the first armed blow in the defense of Southern rights, and within 1 hour by Shrewsbury clock, old Virginia will stand, her battle flags flying by your side. On the morning of the 11th, General Beauregard sent Pryor as a special messenger to Major Anderson demanding the surrender of Fort Sumter, and on his refusal, which was a matter of course, instructed him to go at once to the nearest battery and order the commander to open fire. The formalities at Sumter quickly ended. Pryor repaired to Battery Johnson, met the young captain of artillery in command, and presented his order. With a shout, the captain threw his arms around the messenger and with streaming eyes cried, "Your wonderful speech last night made this glorious thing possible. You shall have the immortal honor of firing the first gun." And then a strange revulsion of feeling, or was it a flash of foreboding? From the hell-lit battle-scorched future, the orator hesitated, turned pale. It was an honor he could not now decline, and yet he instinctively shrank from it. He mopped the perspiration from his brow and looked about in a helpless way. His eyes suddenly rested on a gray-haired, stalwart sentinel passing with firm tread. He recognized him immediately as a distinguished fellow Virginian, a man of large wealth and uncompromising opinion on Southern rights. When Virginia had refused to secede, he cursed his countrymen as a set of hesitating cowards, left the state and moved to South Carolina. He volunteered among the first and carried a musket as a private soldier in spite of his snow-white hairs. Pryor turned to the commandant. "I appreciate, sir, the honor you would do me, but I could not think of taking it from one more worthy than myself. There is a man whose devotion to our cause is greater than mine." He introduced Edmund Ruffin and gave a brief outline of his career. The boyish commandant faced him. "Will you accept the honor of firing the first shot, sir?" The square jaw closed with a snap. "By God, I will." The old man seized the lanyard and waited for the captain and messenger to reach the front to witness the effect of the shot. They had scarcely cleared the enclosure when the first gun of the actual Civil War thundered its fateful message across the still waters of the beautiful southern harbor. They watched the great screaming shell rise into the sky, curve downward, and burst with sullen roar squarely over the doomed fort. The deed was done. Instantly came the answering cry of fierce, ungovernable wrath from the millions of the North. The 4 remaining southern states wheeled into line, flung their battle flags into the sky, and the bloodiest war in the history of the world had begun. Chapter 6 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 6, The Parting of the Ways. The wave of fiery enthusiasm for the Union which swept the North was precisely what the clear eyes of the President had foreseen. 500,000 men would have sprung to their arms if there had been any to spring to. The whole country, north, south, east, and west, was utterly unprepared for war. The regular army of the United States consisted of only 16,000 men, scattered over a vast territory. The President called for 75,000 volunteer militiamen for 3 months' service to restore order in the southern states. Even this number was more than the War Department could equip before their terms would expire, and the President had no authority to call state troops for a longer service. On the day following the call, Massachusetts started 3 fully equipped regiments to the front. The first reached Baltimore on the 19th of April. On their march through the streets to change cars for Washington, they were attacked by a fierce mob, and the first battle of the Civil War was fought. The regiment lost 4 killed and 36 wounded, and the mob 12 killed and a great number wounded. Grimed with blood and dirt, the troops reached Washington at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the first armed rescuers of the capital. They were quartered in the magnificent Senate chamber on Capitol Hill. The president was immediately confronted by the gravest crisis. The first blood had stained the soil of the only slave state which lay between Washington and the loyal North. If Maryland should join the Confederacy, it would be impossible to hold the capital. The city would be surrounded and isolated in hostile territory. From the first, he had believed that the only conceivable way to save the Union was to prevent the border slave states of Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri from joining the South. For a moment it seemed that Maryland was lost, and with it the capital of the nation. A storm of fury swept through the city of Baltimore and the whole state over the killing of our unarmed citizens by the abolition troops from Massachusetts. The mayor of Baltimore set a committee to the president, who declared in the most solemn tones, "It is not possible for more soldiers to pass through Baltimore unless they fight their way at every step." And to make sure that the attempt would not be repeated, he burned the railroad bridges connecting the North and cut every telegraph wire, completely isolating the capital. Gilbert Winter, with his cold blue eyes flashing their slumbering fires of hate, stalked into the White House as the Baltimore committee was passing down the steps. Without announcement, he confronted the president. "Mr. President, in the name of the outraged dignity of this republic," he thundered, "I demand that these traitors be arrested, tried by drumhead court-martial, and hanged as spies." The patient giant figure lifted a big hand in a gesture of mild protest. "Hardly, Senator. And what is your answer?" "I have written the governor and the mayor," the quiet voice went on, "that for the future troops must be brought here, but I made no point of bringing them through Baltimore. Indeed, all I want is to get them here. I've ordered them to march around Baltimore, and in fulfillment of this promise, I've sent a regiment back to Philadelphia to come by water." "Great God! Could cowardice sink to baser crawling?" The tall man merely smiled, his furious visitor starting for the door, and growled, "It is absolutely useless to discuss this question further?" "Absolutely, Senator." "And you will not order our regular troops to take Baltimore immediately at the point of a bayonet?" "I will not." "Good day, sir." "Good day, Senator." With a muttered explosion of wrath, Gilbert Winter shook the dust of the White House floor from his feet and solemnly praised God. It would be many moons before he degraded himself by again entering its portals. The president had need of all his patience and caution in dealing with Maryland. The next protest demanded that the troops should not pass by way of Annapolis or over any other spot of the soil of the state. He calmly but firmly replied, "My troops must reach Washington. They can neither fly over the state of Maryland nor burrow under it. Therefore they must cross it, and your people must learn that there is no piece of American soil too good to be pressed by the foot of a loyal soldier on his march to defend the capital and his country." During these anxious days, while the fate of Maryland hung in the balance, the government was given a startling revelation of what it would mean to have Maryland hostile territory. For a week, the president and his cabinet were in a state of siege. They got no news. They could send none save by courier. The maddest rumors were daily afloat. The president was supposed to be governing a country from which he was completely isolated. The tension at last became unbearable. The giant figure stood for hours alone before his window in the White House, his somber hazel-gray eyes fixed on the hills beyond the Potomac. When the silence could no longer be endured, the anguish of his heart broke forth in impassioned protest. "Great God, why don't they come? Why don't they come? Is our nation a myth? Is there no North?" And then the tide turned and the troops poured into the city. His patient, careful, and friendly treatment of the Marylanders quickly proved his wisdom. A reaction in favor of the Union set in, and the state remained loyal to the flag. The importance of this fact cannot be exaggerated. Without Maryland, Washington could not have been held. And the moment the capital should fall, Europe would recognize the Confederacy. The saving of Maryland for the Union, in fact, established Washington as the real seat of government, though it was destined to remain for years but an armed fortress on the frontiers of a new nation. The stirring events at Sumter and Baltimore brought more than one family to the grief and horror of brother against brother, father against son. John Vaughn stood in his room livid with rage, confronting Ned on the first day that communication was opened with the outside world. "You're not going to do this insane thing, I tell you, Ned." The boyish figure stiffened. "I'm going home to Missouri on the first train out of Washington to raise a company and fight for the South." The older man's voice dropped to persuasive tones. "Isn't there something bigger than fighting for a section? Let's stand by the nation." "That's just what I refuse to do. The United States has never been a nation. This country is a republic of republics, not an empire. The South is going to fight for the right of local self-government and the liberties our fathers won from the tyrants of the old world. The South is right eternally and forever right. The states of this Union have always been sovereign." All right, John growled impatiently. "Granted, my boy, still, secession is impossible. A nation can't jump out of its own skin once it has grown it. This country has become a nation. Steam and electricity have made it so. Railroads have bound us together in iron bands. Can't you see that? No, can't. Right is right. But if we have actually grown into a mighty united people with one tongue and one ideal, is it right to draw the sword to destroy what God has joined together? Silently, swiftly, surely, during the past 30 years, we have become one people, and the love of the Union has become a deathless passion." "You had a poor way of showing it," Ned sneered. "Still, boy, it's true. I didn't realize it myself until that fort was fired on and the flag hauled down. And then it came to me in a blinding flash. Old Webster's voice has been hushed in death, but his soul lives in the heart of our boys. There's hardly one of us who hasn't repeated at school his immortal words. They came back to me with thrilling power the day I read of that shot. They are ringing in my soul today." John paused, and a rapt look crept into his eyes as he began to slowly repeat the closing words of Daniel Webster's speech. "When mine eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious Union, on the states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, or a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, with fratricidal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gracious ensign of a republic, now known and honored throughout the earth, still fully high advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in original luster, not a stripe erased or polluted, not a single star obscured, bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, 'What is all this worth?' nor those other words of delusion and folly. Liberty first and union afterward, but everywhere spread all over with living light, blazing in all of its ample fields. As they flowed over the sea and over the land, and in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment dear to every American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." He paused, his voice choking with emotion as he seized Ned's arm. "Oh, boy, isn't that a greater ideal? That's all the President is asking today, to stand by the Union. He's making war in the South, but only as the South is forcing him reluctantly to defend the Union by force. The South is mad. She'll come to her senses after the shock of the first skirmish is over. With the Southern members in their places, they have a majority in Congress against the President. He can move neither hand nor foot. What has the South to gain by secession? They've always controlled the Union and can continue to do so if they stand united with their Northern friends. In the end, their defeat is as sure as that 20 million free white Americans can whip 5 million of equal courage and daring. They have everything to lose and nothing to gain. It's madness. It surpasses belief. That's why I'm going to fight for them," Ned's answer flashed. "They stand for a principle. Their equal rights under the republic their fathers created. They haven't paused to figure on success or failure. 5 million freemen have drawn the sword against 20 millions because their rights have been invaded. Might has never yet been made right. The South's daring is sublime, and by God I stand with them. His words had the ring of steel in their finality. The two men faced each other for a moment, tense, earnest, defiant. The younger extended his hand. "Goodbye, John." The handsome face of the older brother went suddenly white, and he shook his hand. "No, from today we are no longer brothers. We can't even be friends." Ned smiled, waved his hand, and from the door firmly answered, "As ye like. From today, foes." He closed the door and with swift step turned his face toward the house of Senator Winter. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 7, Love and Duty. The pretty Irish maid nodded and smiled with such a sympathetic look as she ushered Ned into the cozy back parlor. He wondered if it meant anything. Could she have guessed Betty's secret? She might give him a hint that would lift the fear from his heart. He smiled back into her laughing eyes and began awkwardly. "Oh, I say, Peggy." She dropped a pretty courtesy. "Yessuh?" Somehow it wouldn't work. The words refused to come. Love was too big and sweet and sacred. Couldn't be hinted at to a third person, and he merely stammered. "Will you please tell Miss Betty I'm here?" "Yessuh." Peggy giggled. He was happy to be rid of her, drew his handkerchief, mopped the perspiration from his brow, and sat down by the open window to wait. His heart was pounding. He looked about the room with a vague longing. He had spent many a swift hour of pain and joy in this room. The sight and sound of her had grown into his very life. He couldn't realize how intimately and how hopelessly until this moment of parting, perhaps forever. The portrait of her mother hung over the mantel, a life-size oil painting by a noted French artist. The same brilliant laughing eyes, the same deep golden brown hair, its wayward ringlets playing loosely about her fine forehead and shell-like ears. Beyond a doubt, this pretty mother, with the sunshine of France in her blood, had known how to flirt in her day, and her beautiful daughter was enough like that picture to have been her twin sister. On the mantel beneath this portrait sat photographs in solid silver frames, one of Wendell Phillips, one of William Lloyd Garrison, and one of John C. Fremont, the first Republican candidate for president. Directly opposite on the wall hung an oil painting of John Brown. Ned caught the flash of the fanatic in the old madman's eye and was startled at the striking resemblance to Senator Winter. He had never thought of it before. Gilbert Winter might have been his brother in the flesh, as he undoubtedly was in spirit. The thought chilled. He looked out the window with a sigh, and wondered how far the old tyrant would carry his hatred of the South into his daughter's life. His eyes rested for a moment on the row of lilacs in full bloom in the garden, and caught the flash of the big new leaves of the magnolia which shadowed the rear wall. The early honeysuckle had begun to blossom on the south side, and the violet beds were a solid mask of gorgeous blue. Through the open window came the rich odor of the long rows of narcissus in full white glory with the jonquilla which had flamed a month ago. What a beautiful world to be beaten into a scarred battlefield. For just a moment the thought had wrung the heart of youth and love. It was hard just when the tenderest and sweetest impulses that ever filled his soul were clamoring for speech, to turn his back on all, say goodbye and go to war, perhaps to kill his own brother. And there could be no mistake. War had come. Overhead he caught the steady tramp of Senator Winter's feet, a caged lion walking back and forth, with hungry eyes turned toward the south. He could feel his deadly hostility through the very walls. Battery of artillery suddenly roared through the streets, the dull, heavy rattle of its wheels over the cobblestones, and the crack of the driver's whip echoed and re-echoed through the house. Behind it came the steady tramp-tramp of a regiment of infantry. the loud call of their volunteer officers ringing sharply their orders. At the turn of the street, far off on Capitol Hill, he heard the sharp note of a bugle and the rattle of horses' hooves. Every hour the raw troops were pouring into the city from the north, the east, and the west. He wondered with a strange catch in his throat what difference this was going to make between him and the girl he loved. There was no longer any question about the love. He marveled that he had been too stupid to realize it and speak before this shadow had fallen between them. She knew that his sympathies were with the South, and he knew with equal certainty she had never believed that he would fight to destroy the Union when the test should come. He dreaded the shock when he must tell her. His heart grew sick with fear. What chance had he, with everything against him? Her old fanatical father who loved her with the tender devotion of his strong manhood, her own blind admiration for the new president whose coming had brought war, and worst of all, he must go and leave John by her side. His brother had given no hint of his real feelings. He had seen Betty every week since the day they had met, sometimes twice. This he knew. There may have been times he didn't know. All the more reason why he must put the thing to the test. Besides, he must speak. His hour had been struck. His country was calling, and he must go to meet death or glory. The woman he loved must know. He heard the soft rustle of her dress on the stairs and sprang to his feet. She paused in the doorway, a vision of ravishing beauty in full evening dress, her bare arms and exquisite neck and throat gleaming in the shadows. She smiled graciously, her brown eyes sparkling with the conscious power which youth and beauty can never conceal. She held out her soft, warm hand, and the trembling, cold fingers grasped it. "I'm sorry to have kept you, Ned," she began softly, "but I was dressing for the reception at the White House. I promised Mrs. Lincoln to help her." "I didn't mind the wait, Miss Betty," he answered soberly. "Come into the garden. I can talk better there among your flowers. I'll never mind waiting for you." "Why?" "I've time to dream." "Before you must awake?" She laughed. "I'm afraid it's so this time." "Why so serious? What's the matter?" "I'm going to the front. So are thousands of brave men, Ned. I always knew you'd go when the test came." He bit his lip and was silent. It was hard, but he had to say it. "I'm going to fight for the South, Miss Betty." The silence was painful. She looked steadily in his dark, earnest eyes. There was something too big and fine in them to be met with anger or reproach. He was deadly pale and waited breathlessly for her to speak. "I'm sorry," she breathed softly. "You know that it cost me something to say this to you," he stammered. "Yes, I know. But it must be. It's a question of principle, a question that cuts to the bone of a fellow's life and character. A man must be true to what he believes to be right, mustn't he?" His voice was tender, wistful, pleading. The sweet young face turned upward to catch his mood. "Yes, Ned. I couldn't be a real man and do less, could I?" "No, but I'm sorry." She paused and suddenly asked, "Your brother agrees with you?" Ned frowned. "Why would you ask that question?" "Because I was sure that he was on our side." "Is that all?" "And I've always supposed he was a sort of guardian, only because he has always been my big brother, and I've loved and admired him very much. Cried my eyes out on the day he left home in Missouri, came east to college." "And you're going to fight him?" "It's possible." "It's horrible. And yet men who are not savages could only do such things, drawn by the mightiest forces that move a human soul. You must know that, Miss Betty." "Yes. There's only one thing in life that's bigger, and that is love. I've held it too highly and holy a word to speak lightly. I shall tell but one woman that I love her." She looked at him tenderly. "You glorious, foolish boy." Pale and trembling, he took her hand, led her to a seat, and sank on his knees by her side. "I love you, Betty," he gasped. "I've loved you from the moment we met, tenderly, madly, reverently. I've been afraid to touch your hand lately, lest you feel the pounding of my heart and know. And now it's come to this hour when I must say I love you and goodbye in the same breath. Be gentle and sweet to me. I'm afraid to ask you if you love me. It's too good to be true. I'm not worthy to even touch your little hand, and yet I'm daring to hold it in mine." He paused and bowed his head, overcome with emotion. Betty gently pressed his trembling fingers. Her voice was low. "I'm proud of your love, Ned. It's very beautiful. But you don't love me. Not as you love me. He looked searchingly and hungrily in her brown eyes. Is it John? She shook her head slowly, thoughtfully. No. And it's no one else? No. Then I won't take that answer, he cried with desperate earnestness. I'm going to win you. I love you with a love so big and true I'll make you love me. Everything's against me now. Your father's against me. I'm going to fight your country and your people. You admire the new president. I despise him. The passions of war have separated us, that's all, but I won't give up. This war can't last long. You'll see things different when it ends. Betty smiled into his pleading eyes. How little you know me, boy. Nothing on this earth could separate me from the man I love. She paused and breathed quickly. I'd follow him blindfolded to the bottomless pit once I'd given him my heart. Ned rose suddenly to his feet and drew Betty with him. His hand was now hot with the passion that fired his soul. Then you're worth fighting for. And I'm going to fight. Fight for what I believe to be right and fight for you. He stopped suddenly and his slender figure straightened. I'm coming back to you, Betty, he said with clear, ringing emphasis. I'm coming back to Washington. I'll be with an army conquering triumphant because they are right. There'll be a new president in the White House and I'll win. He bowed and reverently kissed the tips of her fingers. You glorious boy, she sighed. It's beautiful to be loved like that. I'm proud of it. I'll hold my head a little higher with every thought of you. And you'll think of me sometimes when the war has separated us. I'll never forget. And remember that I'm fighting my way back to your side. A tender smile played about the corners of her eyes and her mouth. I'll remember. With a quick, firm movement, he turned, passed through the house, and strode toward the iron gates. He suddenly confronted John entering. The two brothers faced each other for a moment angrily and awkwardly, and then the anger slowly melted from the younger man's eyes. You're taking dinner with Miss Betty tonight? Ned asked in friendly tones. Yes, I'm going with her to the White House, was the cold reply. I'm leaving in an hour. Don't you think it's foolish for two brothers who have been what you and I have been to each other to part like this? We may not see one another again. John hesitated and then slowly slipped his arm around the younger man, holding him in silence. When his voice was steady, he said, Forgive me, boy. I was blind with anger. It meant so much to me, but we'll face it. We have to fight it out as God gives us wisdom to see the right. Ned's hand found his and clasped it firmly. As God gives us to see the right, John. Goodbye. Goodbye, boy. It's hard to say it. They clung to each other for a moment and slowly drew apart as the shadows of the soft spring night deepened. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 8, The Trial by Fire. The troops transformed Washington from a lazy southern town of 60,000 inhabitants into an armed fortress of the frontier, swarming with 250,000 excited men and women. Soldiers thronged the streets and sidewalks and sprawled over every inch of greensward, their uniforms of every cut and color, on which the sun of heaven had shone during the past 200 years of history. When the tumult and the shouts of departing regiments had died away from the hometowns in the north, and the flags that were flying from every house had begun to fade under the hot rays of the advancing summer, the patriotic orators and editors began to demand of their president why his grand army of 75,000 lingered at the Capitol. When he mildly suggested the necessity of drilling, equipping, and properly arming them, he was laughed at by the wise and scoffed at as a coward by the brave. Mutterings of discontent grew deeper and more threatening. They demanded a short, sharp, decisive campaign. Let the army wheel into line, march straight into Richmond, take Jeff Davis a prisoner, hang him and a few leaders of the rebellion, and the trouble would be over. This demand became at length the maddened cry of the mob. On to Richmond. Every demagogue howled it, every newspaper repeated it, as city after city and state after state took up the cry. The pressure on the man at the helm of government became resistless. It was a political necessity to fight a battle, and fight at once or lose control of the people he had been called to lead. The abolitionists only sneered at this cry. They demanded an answer to a single insistent question. What are you going to fight about? A battle which does not settle the question of slavery, they declared, would be a waste of blood and treasure. If the slave was not the issue, why fight? The South would return to the Union, which they had always ruled if left alone. Why fight them for nothing? Gilbert Winter, their spokesman at Washington, again confronted the president with his uncompromising demand, an immediate proclamation of emancipation, and the president, with quiet dignity, refused to consider it. Why? Again thundered the senator. His answer was always the same. I am not questioning the right or wrong of slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But the Constitution, which I have sworn to uphold in the border states of Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, guarantees to their people the right to hold slaves if they choose. We have already 11 southern states solidly arrayed against us. Add the border states by such a proclamation, and the contest is settled before a blow is struck. I know the power of state loyalty in the South. I was born there. Many a mother in Richmond wept the day the stars and stripes were lowered from their capital, and well they might, for their sires created this republic. But they brushed their tears away and sent their sons to the front the next day to fight that flag in the name of Virginia. So would thousands of mothers in these remaining slave states if I put them to the test. I'm going to save them for the Union. In God's own time, slavery will be destroyed. Against every demand of the heart of the party which had given him power, he stood firm in the position he had taken. But there was no resisting the universal demand for a march on Richmond. The cry was literally from 20 millions. He must heed it or yield the reins of power to more daring hands. To add to the president's burden, the Secretary of State was still dreaming of foreign wars. Secretary Seward had drawn up a letter of instruction to our minister to Great Britain, which would have provoked an armed conflict. When the backwoodsman from southern Illinois read this document, he was compelled to lay aside his other duties and practically rewrite it. His work showed a freedom of mind, a balance of judicial temperament, an insight into foreign affairs, a skill in the use of language, a delicacy of criticism, a mastery of the arts of diplomacy which placed him among the foremost statesmen of any age and all the ages. He saved the nation from a second disastrous war as a mere matter of the routine of his office, and at once turned to the pressing work of the approaching battle. John Vaughan had joined the army as a correspondent for his paper, and Betty had been his companion on many tours of inspection through the camp, hospitals, and drill grounds. Her quick wit and brilliant mind were an inspiring stimulus. She was cool and self-possessed, and it rested him to be near her. She was the only restful woman he had ever encountered at short range. He was delighted that she seemed content without love-making. There was never a moment when he could catch the challenge of sex in a word or attitude. He might have been her older brother, so perfect and even, so free and simple her manner. Betty had watched him with the keenest caution. The first glance at John's handsome face had convinced her of his boundless vanity, and beneath it a streak of something cruel. She would have liked him instantly but for this. His vanity she could forgive. All good-looking men are vain. His character was a study of which she never tired. He strangely distressed and disturbed her, and this kept puzzling and piquing her curiosity. Every time she determined to end their association, this everlasting question of the man's inner character came to torment her imagination. She was a little disappointed at his not volunteering at the first call, as his gallant young brother had done, yet his reasoning was sound. "What's the use?" he replied to her question. 5 men have already volunteered for every one who can be used. I'm not a soldier by profession or inclination. Campaign of 30 days, one big battle, and the war's over. The president has more men than he can arm or equip. My paper needs me. The army encamped along the banks of the Potomac received orders to advance for the long-expected battle in the hills of Virginia. Betty stood with the crowds of sweethearts, wives and sisters and mothers, and watched them march away through the dust and heat and grime of the southern summer, drums throbbing, banners streaming, bayonets flashing, and bands playing. John Vaughan was in the ranks of a New York regiment. He pressed Betty's hand with a lingering touch he hadn't intended. She seemed unconscious that he was holding him. "You are going to march in the ranks?" she asked in surprise. "Yes. I want to see war as it is. These boys are my friends from New York." "You won't fight with them?" "No. Just see with their eyes, that's all, and then tell you exactly what happened. I can hide behind a barn or a tree without being court-martialed." She looked at him quickly with a new interest, pressed his hand, and said, "Good luck, and home again soon," he cried with a wave of his arms as he hurried to join his marching men. The army camped at Centerville, 7 miles from Beauregard's lines, and spent the 19th and 20th of July resting and girding their loins for the first baptism of fire. The volunteers were eager for the fray. The first touch of the skirmishers had resulted in 15 or 20 killed, but the action had been too far away to make any serious impression. Between the two armies crept the silvery thread of the little stream of Bull Run, its clear, beautiful waters flashing in the July sun. Saturday night, the 20th, orders were issued to John's regiment to be in readiness to advance against the enemy at 2 o'clock before day Sunday morning. A thrill of fierce excitement swept the camp. They were loaded down with overcoats, haversacks, knapsacks, and baggage without end. The single New York regiment to which he had attached himself required 40 wagons to move its baggage. They had a bakery and a cooking establishment that would have done credit to Broadway. They hurriedly packed all they could carry in readiness for the march into battle. What would happen to the rest, God only knew. But they hoped for the best. Of course, the battle couldn't last long. It was only necessary for this grand army to make a demonstration with its drums throbbing, its fifes screaming, its bayonets flashing, and its magnificent uniforms glittering in the sun. The plumes, the Scotch bonnets, the Turkish fez, the Garibaldi shirts, the blue and gray and gold, the black and yellow, and the red and blue of the fire zouaves. When the rebel mob saw these things, they would take to their heels. What the boys were really afraid of was that every rebel would escape before they could use their handcuffs and ropes. This would be too bad, because the procession through the crowded streets at home would be incomplete without captives, as a warning to future traitors. They were going to have a load to carry with their blankets, rolls, haversacks, knapsacks, and the full fighting round of cartridges, but they were not going to leave the handcuffs. If they had to drop anything on the march, they might ease up on a blanket or half their heavy cartridges. John found sleep impossible and was ready to march at 1 o'clock. The dust was rising already in parched clouds from the dry Virginia roads. He walked to the edge of the woods and gazed over the dark moonlit hills around Centerville. A gentle breeze began to stir the leaves overhead, but it was hot and lifeless. He caught the smell of sweating horses and a battery of artillery hitched for the march. It was going to be a day of frightful heat under the clear blazing sun of the South. This Sunday, the 21st of July, 1861. He could see already in his imagination the long lines of sweating, half-fainting marchers staggering under the strain. Yet not for a moment did he doubt the result. From a store on the hill at Centerville came the plaintive strains of a Negro's voice, accompanied by a banjo. A crowd of congressmen had driven out from Washington on a picnic to see the spectacle of the first and last battle of the rebellion. They were drinking good whiskey and making merry. For the first time, a little doubt crept into his mind. Were they all too cocksure? It might be a serious business after all. It was only for a moment, and his fears vanished. He was glad Ned was not in those gray lines in the front. His company had been formed promptly, and he had been elected first lieutenant, but they were still in southern Missouri under General Sterling Price. He shouldn't like to come on his brother's dead body or wounded after the battle, the young daredevil fool. Promptly at 2 o'clock, the sharp orders rang from the regimental commander. "Forward, march!" The line swung carelessly into the powdered dust of the road and moved forward into the fainting moonlight, talking, laughing, chatting, joking. War was yet a joke, and the contagious fire of patriotism had flung its halo even over this night's work. Except here and there a veteran of the Mexican War, not one of these men had ever seen a battle or had the remotest idea of what it was like. John was marching with Sherman's brigade of Tyler's division. At 6 o'clock they reached the stone bridge which crossed Bull Run. On the hills beyond stretched a straggling line of gray figures. Couldn't be an army. Only a few skirmishers, thrown out to warn off an attempt to cross the bridge. A white puff of smoke flashed on a hill towards the south, and the deep boom of a Confederate cannon echoed over the valley. Tyler's guns answered in grim chorus. The men gripped their muskets and waited the word of command. John's brigade was deployed along the edge of a piece of woods on the right of the Warrenton Turnpike and stood for hours. A rumble of disgust swept the lines. "What are we waiting for? Why don't we get at 'em? And this is war? And no breakfast either." An hour passed, and only the occasional crack of a musket across the shining thread of silver water and the slow, sullen echo of artillery. They seemed to be just practicing. The shots all fell short. Nobody was hurt. Another hour. It was 8 o'clock, and they still stood and looked off into space. 9 o'clock passed, and the fierce rays of the climbing July sun drove the men to the shelter of the trees. "If this is war," yelled a red-breeched, fierce young Zouave, "I'll take firecrackers and a 4th of July for mine." "Keep your shirt on, sonny," observed a corporal. "We may have some fun yet before night." At 10 o'clock something happened. Suddenly 1,000 gray-clad men leaped from their cover over the hills and swept up streams double quick. A solid mass of dust-covered figures were swarming over the stone bridge. The regiment's battery dashed into position. Its guns were trained, and the roar shook the earth. The swarming gray lines below the bridge paid no attention. The shots fell short, and Sherman sent for heavier guns. The men in gray had formed a new line of battle and faced the Sudley and Newmarket road. Far up the road could now be seen a mighty cloud of dust which marked the approach of the main body of McDowell's Union army. He had made a wide flank movement across Bull Run at Sudley Ford and was attempting to completely turn the Confederate position while Sherman held the stone bridge with a demonstration of force. A cheer swept the line as the dust rose higher and denser and nearer. Banks of storm clouds were rising from the horizon. The air was thick and oppressive as the two armies drew close in tense battle array. The turning movement had only been partly successful. It had been discovered before complete, and a gray line had wheeled, gripped their muskets, and stood ready to meet the attack. The dust clouds suddenly fell. McDowell's 2 divisions of 18,000 men spread out in the woods and made ready for the shock. The sun burst through the gathering clouds for a moment, and the edge of the woods flashed with polished steel. A Federal battery dashed into position and placed one of its big black-wheel guns in the front yard of a little whitewashed farmhouse. The farmer's wife faced the commander with indignant fury. "Take that thing out in my front yard." The dust and sweat-covered men paid no attention. They quickly sunk the wheels into the ground and piled their shells in place for work. The old woman stamped her foot and shouted again. "Take that thing away, I tell you. I won't have it here." The captain seized his lanyard, trained his piece, and the big black lips roared. With a scream of terror, the woman covered her ears, rushed inside, and slammed the door. They found her torn and mangled body there after the battle. An answering shell had crashed through the roof and exploded. Sherman's men, standing in the woods before the stone bridge, waiting orders, saw the white and blue fog of battle rise above the treetops and felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. And then came to John's ears the first full crash of musketry fire in close, deadly range. As company, regiment, brigade joined in volley after volley, it was like the sound of the continuous ripping of heavy canvas, magnified on the scale of 1,000. As the storm cloud swept over the smoke-choked field, the rattle of musketry sounded as if an angry god rode somewhere in their fiery depths and with giant hand was ripping the heavens open. An hour passed, and a shout of triumph swept the Federal lines. They charged and drove the Confederate forces back half a mile from their first stand. There was a lull. A strange silence brooded over the flaming woods, and guns opened from their new positions, the artillery's deep thunder and ripping crash of muskets. Another hour and another wild shout of victory. They had driven the Southerners 3/4 of a mile further. The shouts suddenly stopped. They had struck something. The grim, dust-covered figure of a Southern brigadier general on a little sorrel horse had barred the way. His bulging forehead, with its somber blue eyes, hung ominously over the pommel of his shadow. General B of South Carolina, rallying his shattered, broken brigade, pointed his sword to the strange figure and shouted to his men, "See Jackson standing like a stone wall! Rally to the Virginians!" A bursting shell struck him dead in the next instant, but the world had heard the name Stonewall, and it became immortal. With the last shout, the cry of victory had swept the field to the farthest line of reserve. John Vaughn secured a horse, galloped to the nearest telegraph, and sent the thrilling news to his paper. Already the wires were flashing to the furthest cities of North and West. Victory! The first and last battle of the war had been settled. He spurred his horse through the blistering heat back to his regiment to join in the pursuit of the flying enemy. They were just dashing across Bull Run, going into action, their battle flag flying and their band playing. They were not long in finding the foe. The obstruction still remained in the path of the advancing host. The grim figure on the little sorrel horse had just ordered his brigade to fix bayonets. In sharp tones, his command was snapped. "Charge and take that battery!" A low gray cloud rose from the hills, swept over the cracked Federal battery of Ricketts and Griffin, and captured their guns. John's regiment reached the field just in time to see the cannoneers fall in their tracks at the first deadly volley from the charging men. Every horse was struck down dead or wounded. The pitiful cries of the stricken horses rang over the field above the roar of battle, pathetic, heart-rending, sickening. The two armies had clinched now in the grim struggle, which meant defeat or victory. It was incredible that the army, which swept the field for 4 terrible hours, should fail. The new regiments formed in line and with a shout of desperation charged Jackson's men and retook the captured battery. Again the men in gray rallied and tore the guns a second time from the hands of their owners. John saw a shell explode directly beneath a magnificent house on which a general sat, directing his men. The house was blown to atoms, and the general was hurled 20 feet into the air and struck the ground on his feet. He was unhurt, called for another horse, mounted, and led the third charge to recover the guns. For a moment the two battle lines mingled in deadly hand-to-hand combat, and once more the guns were retaken. It had scarcely been done before Jackson's men rallied, turned, and swift as a bolt of lightning from the smoke-covered hill, captured the guns a third time and held them. And then the unexpected, imagining thing happened. A new cloud of dust rose over the hill towards Manassas Junction. The Southerners were hoping against hope that it might be Kirby Smith with his lost regiment from Shenandoah Valley. The regiment had been expected since noon. It was now 3:30. General McDowell, the Union's commander, was hoping against hope that Patterson's army from the Shenandoah would join his. They were not long in doubt. The fresh troops suddenly swung into position on McDowell's right flank. If they were allies, all was well. If they were foes, suddenly from this line of battle rose a new cry on the face of the earth. From 2,000 dusty throats came a heaven-piercing and shivering shout, the cry of the Southern hunter in sight of his game, a cry that was destined to ring over many a field of death, the fierce, wild rebel yell. They charged McDowell's right flank with resistless onslaught. Kirby Smith fell desperately wounded, and Elzey took command. Beckham's battery unlimbered and poured into the ranks from the rear, a storm of shell. McDowell swung his battle line into a fiery crescent and made his last desperate stand. Jubal Early, Elzey's brigade, and Stonewall Jackson charged at the same signal, and then pandemonium, blind, unreasoning panic seized the Army of the North. They broke and fled. Brave officers cursed and swore in vain. The panic grew. Men rushed pell-mell, one over the other, white with terror. They threw down their muskets, knapsacks, or haversacks, and ran for their lives, every man for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. In vain the regular army with splendid discipline formed a rear guard to effect an orderly retreat. The crack of their guns only made the men run faster. The wildest rumors flew from parched tongue to throbbing ear. An army of 100,000 fresh troops had fallen on their tired, bloody ranks. They were led by Jeb Stuart at the head of his 4,000 Black Horse cavalry. If a single man escaped alive, it would be for one reason: only they could outrun him. It was a crime for officers to try to round them up with such a massacre. That's all it was, a massacre. With each mad thought of the rushing mob, and the panic grew. They cut the traces of horses from guns and left them on the field. The frantic mob engulfed the buggies and carriages of the congressmen and picnickers from Washington who had come out to see the rebellion put down at a single blow. The road became a mass of neighing, plunging horses, broken and tangled wagons, ambulances, and riderless artillery teams. Horses neighed in terror more abject than that which filled the hearts of men. Men once had reason. The poor horse had never claimed it. The blockades on the road formed no barrier to the flying men on foot. They streamed around and overflowed into the woods and fields and pressed on with new terror. God in heaven! They pitied the poor fools engulfed in those masses of maddening, plunging brutes and smashing wagons. It was only a question of a few minutes when Stuart's sabers would split every skull. John Vaughan was swept to the rear on the crest of this wave of terror. Up to the moment it began, he had scarcely thought of danger. After the first few minutes of nerve tension under the fire, his spirit had risen as combat raged and deepened. It didn't seem real, the falling of men around him. He had no time to realize that they were being torn to pieces by shot and shell, and the hail of lead that whistled from those long sheets of flaming smoke banks before him. And then panic had seized him. He caught its mad, unreasoning terror from the men who surged about him, that it was every man for himself. The charge was swift, abject, complete, from utter consciousness of fear to the blindest terror. Some ran mechanically with their eyes set in front, as if stiff with fear, expecting each moment to be struck dead, knowing it was useless to try, but going on, and because involuntary muscles were carrying them. A fat man caught hold of John's coat and held on for half a mile before he could shake him off. He begged piteously for help. "Don't leave me, partner," he panted. "I'm a sinful man, ain't fit to die. You're young and strong. Save me." The dead weight was pulling him down, and John shook the fellow off with an angry jerk. "To hell with you." They suddenly came to a lot of horses held and hidden in woods, rearing and plunging and neighing madly. John swerved out of their way, and an officer rushed up to him. "Why don't you take a horse?" He looked at him in a dazed way before he could realize his meaning. "Take a horse," he yelled. "The rebels will get him if you don't." The men were too intent on running to try to save horses. Horses would have to look out for themselves. Suddenly occurred to John that a horse might go faster. Funny he hadn't thought of it at once. He turned, seized one, mounted, and galloped on. There was a quick halt. A panting mob came surging back over the way they had just fled. A ford in front had been blocked, and in the scramble the cry was raised that Stuart's cavalry were on them and cutting every soul down in his tracks at the crossing. John leaped from his horse, turned, and ran straight for the woods. He didn't propose to be captured by Stuart's cavalry, that was sure. He turned to look back and ran into a tree, climbed it, if he could only get to the top before they saw him. He had been an expert climber when a boy in Missouri, and he thanked God now for this. He never paused for breath until he had reached the very top, where he drew the swaying branches close about his body to hide from the coming foe. The sun was yet hanging over the trees in the woods, a ball of sullen red fire lighting up the hiding place of the last poor devil for the eyes of the avenging hosts who were sweeping on. If it were night, it would be all right, but this was no place for a man with an ounce of sense in broad daylight. The sharpshooters would see him in that tall tree, sure. They couldn't take him prisoner up there. They would shoot him like a squirrel just to see him tumble, and by the Lord Harry, they would do it too. He got down from the tree faster than he climbed up, and from the edge of the woods spied a dense swamp. He never stopped until he reached the center of it and dropped flat on his stomach. "Thank God at last," he sighed. The Northern Army fleeing for Washington had left on the field 28 guns, 4,000 muskets, 9 regimental flags, 481 dead, 1,011 wounded, and 1,400 captured. The road to the rear was literally sown with pistols, knapsacks, blankets, haversacks, wagons, tools, and hospital stores. And saddest of all the wreck lay the bright new handcuffs with coils of hangman's rope scattered everywhere. The Southern Army had lost 387 killed including 2 brigadier generals, B and Barton, and 1,500 wounded. They were so completely scattered and demoralized by their marvelous, overwhelming victory that any systematic pursuit of their foe was impossible. The strange, silent figure on the little sorrel horse turned his blue eyes towards Washington from the last hilltop as darkness fell, lifted his head suddenly toward the sky, and cried, 10,000 fresh troops, and I'd be in Washington tomorrow night. The troops were not to be had, and Stonewall Jackson ordered his men to bivouac for the night, sent out his detail to bury the dead and care for the wounded of both armies. Monday morning dawned black and lowering, and before the sun rose, the rain poured in steady torrents. Through every hour of this desolate, sickening day, the weary, terror-stricken stragglers trailed through the streets of Washington, their gorgeous plumes soaked and drooping, the Scotch bonnets dripping, the rain straight down on their necks and across their dirty foreheads, their Garibaldi shirts, the blue and the gray, the black and the yellow, and gold and blazing zouave uniforms, rain-soaked and mud-smeared. Betty Winter bought out a peddler's cake and lemonade stand on the main line of this ghastly procession, and through every bitter hour from sunrise until dark stood there cheering and serving the men without money and without price, while the tears slowly rolled down her flushed cheeks. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 9, Victory and Defeat. The President had risen at daylight on the fateful Sunday morning. He was sorry this first action must be fought on Sunday. It seemed a bad omen. The preachers from his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, had issued a manifesto against his election, without regard to their party affiliations, on account of his supposed hostility to religion. It had hurt and stung his pride more than any single incident in the campaign. His nature was profoundly religious. He was not a church member because his religion had the unique quality of a personal faith which refused from sheer honesty to square itself with the dogmas of any sect. The preachers had not treated him fairly, but he cherished no ill will. He knew their sterling worth to the Republic, and he meant to use them in the tremendous task before him. He had hoped the battle would not be joined until Monday, but he knew at dawn that a clash was inevitable. At 10:30, though keenly anxious for the first news from the front, he was ready to accompany Mrs. Lincoln to church. The breeze was from the south, a hot, lazy, midsummer heavy air. The commander-in-chief bent his giant figure over a war map spread on his desk, fixed the positions of each army by colored pens, studied them a moment, and then quietly walked with his wife to the Presbyterian church to hear Dr. Gurley speak. He sat in reverent silence through the service, his soul hovering over the distant hills. Before midnight, the panic-stricken congressmen began to drop in to the White House, each with his story of unparalleled disaster. At 1 o'clock, the president stood in the midst of a group of excited, perspiring statesmen who had crowded into the executive office. The one cool, shrewd, patient, self-possessed, courageous man among them. He reviewed their stories quietly and with no sign of excitement, to say nothing of panic. They marveled at his dull intellect. He was listening in silence, shaping the big new policy of his administration. He spent the entire night calmly listening to all these stories, speaking a word of good cheer where it would be of service. Mr. Seward entered, as he had just finished a light breakfast. The secretary's hair was disheveled, his black string tie under his ear, and he was taking 2 pinches of snuff within the time he usually took 1. In 30 minutes, the outlines of his message to Congress and his new proclamation were determined. Mr. Seward left with new courage and a growing sense of reliance on the wisdom, courage, and intellectual power of the chief he had thought to supplant without a struggle. At 8 o'clock, the man with a grievance made his first appearance. His wrath was past the boiling point, in spite of the fact that his handsome uniform was still wet from the night's wild ride. He went straight to the point. He was a volunteer patriot of high standing in the community. As a citizen of the Republic, wearing its uniform, he represented its dignity and power. He had been grossly insulted by a military marionette from West Point, and he proposed to test the question whether an American citizen had any rights such men must respect. The president lifted his calm, deep eyes to the flushed, angry face, glanced at the gold marks of his rank, and said, What can I do for you, Captain? I've come to ask, Mr. President, he began with subdued intensity, whether a volunteer officer of this country, a man of culture and position, is to be treated as a dog or as a human being. The quiet man at the desk slipped his glasses from his ears, polished them with his handkerchief, readjusted them, and looked up again with kindly interest. What's the trouble? A discussion arose in our regiment on the day we were ordered into battle over the expiration of our enlistment. I held as a lawyer, sir, that every day of rotten manual labor we had faithfully performed for our country should be counted for our 3 months of service. Our time had expired, and I demanded that we be discharged then and there. On the eve of a battle? Certainly, sir. What had that to do with our rights? We could have re-enlisted on the spot. I refused to take orders from the upstart who commanded our brigade. What happened? The calm voice asked. He dared to threaten my life, sir. Who was he? Colonel in the command of our brigade, named Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman? Yes, sir. What'd he say to you? Swore that if I moved an inch to leave his command, he'd shoot me. He said that to you? Swore he'd shoot me down in my tracks like a dog. The president gravely rose, placed a big hand on the young officer's shoulder, and in serious, friendly tones said, If I were in your place, Captain, I wouldn't trust that man, Sherman. I believe he'll do it. The astonished volunteer looked up with a puzzled, sheepish expression, turned, and shot out of the room. The long figure dropped into a chair and doubled with laughter. He rose and walked to his window, looking out to the trees, swaying behind the storm, still laughing. They say that every cloud has its silver lining. He laughed again. I'll remember that fellow Sherman. Later that day, a report reached him of a beautiful young woman serving refreshments without pay to the straggling broken men. He turned to Nicolay, his secretary. Get my carriage, find her, and bring her to me. I want to see her. Betty's eyes were still red when she walked into his office. He sprang to his feet with long strides, met her. He grasped her hand in both his and pressed it tenderly. So it's you, he whispered. Betty nodded. My little cabinet comforter. I'm afraid I'll be no good today, she faltered. Then I'll cheer you, he cried. I just wanted to thank the woman who's been standing behind a lemonade counter through this desolate day, giving her time, money, and her soul to our discouraged boys. And you're not discouraged? Betty asked pathetically. Not by a long shot, my child. Brush those tears away. Jeffy D's the man to be discouraged today. This will be a dearly bought victory, mark my words. For the South, it's the glorious end of the war. While they shout, I'll be sawing wood. It needed just this shock and humiliation to bring the North to the senses. Watch 'em buckle on their armor now in deadly earnest. The demagogues howled for a battle. They pushed us in, and they got it. Some of the congressmen who yelled the loudest for a march straight into Richmond without even a pause to water their horses got tangled up in that stampede from Bull Run. They thought old Jeb Stuart's cavalry was on them, and they lost their lunch basket. It's in the scramble. They've seen a great light. I'll get all the money I asked Congress for, and all the soldiers we need for any length of time. I've asked for $400 million and 500,000 men for 3 years. Shouldn't be surprised if they voted more. The people will have sense enough to see that this defeat was exactly what they should have expected under such conditions. His spirit was contagious. Betty forgot her shame and fear. You're wonderful, Mr. President, the girl cried in rapt tones. Now I know that you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. So have you, my child, he answered reverently. And so has every brave woman who loves this union. That's what I wanted to say to you, and thank you for your example. Betty left the White House with a new sense of inspiration. She walked on air, unconscious of the pouring rain. She paused before a throng that blocked the sidewalk. Some of them were bareheaded, the raindrops splashing in their faces, apparently unconscious of anything that was happening. She pushed her way into the crowd. They were looking at the bulletin board of the Daily Republican, reading the first list of dead and wounded. Her heart suddenly began to pound. John Vaughan had not reported his return. He might be lying stark and cold, with rain beating down on his mangled body. She read each name in the list of the dead and drew a sigh of relief. But the last bulletin was not cheering. It promised additional names for a later edition. Besides, the War Department might not be relied on for reports of non-combatants. A newspaper correspondent was not enrolled as a soldier. His death might remain unrecorded for days. On a sudden impulse, she started to enter the office and asked if he had returned. Stopped, blushed, turned, and hurried home with a new fear, mingled with a strange joy beating in her heart. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Southerner, Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 10, The Awakening. John Vaughn had secured a loose horse on emerging from his friendly swamp. The shadows of night had given him the chance to escape. His horse was fresh, the rain had begun to fall as the heat had abated, and he made good time. Reached the office before midnight, took a seat at his desk, pale and determined to tell the truth. He wrote an account of the battle and the panic which it had ended, so vivid, so accurate, so terrible in its confession of fright and dismay, the editor refused to print it. Why not? John sternly demanded. It won't do. It's true. Then the less said about it, the better. Let's hush it up. John smiled. I'm sorry. I'd like to see that thing in type, just as I saw it, felt it, and lived it. It's a good story, and it's my last. It's a pity to kill it. Your last? What do you mean? Chief broke in. That I'm going into the ranks and see if I'm a coward. He paused and scowled. It looked like it yesterday for a while, and my curiosity's aroused. Besides, the country happens to need me. Rubbish, the editor cried. The country will get all the men it needs without you. You're a trained newspaper man. We need you here. Thanks, my mind's made up. I'm going to Missouri and raise a company. Chief laid a hand on John's shoulder. Don't be a fool. Stand by the ship. I'll put your damn story in just as you wrote it, if that's what hurts. John flushed and shook his head. But it isn't. You may be right about that stuff. If I were editor, I'd kill it myself. No, my dander's up. I want a little taste of the real thing. I saw enough yesterday to interest me. The country's calling, and I've got to go. The boys crowded around him and shook hands. From the door, he waved goodbye, and they shouted in chorus, good luck. Arrived at his room, he wrote a note to Betty Winter. He read over it and seemed foolish and formal. He tore it up and wrote a simpler one. It was flippant and a little presumptuous. He destroyed that and decided on a single line. My dear Miss Betty, can I see you a few minutes before leaving tonight? John Vaughn. He sent it and began hurriedly to dress, his mind in a whirl of nervous excitement. His vanity had not even paused to ask whether her answer would be yes. He was sure of it. The big exciting thing was he had made a thrilling discovery in the midst of that insane panic. He was in love for the first time in his life, foolishly, madly in love. Fighting and elbowing his way through the throng of desperate, terror-stricken men and the horses. It had come to him in a flash that life was sweet and precious because Betty Winter was in it. The more he thought of it, the more desperate became his determination not to be killed until he could see her and tell her. Through every moment of his wild scramble through the woods and fields and crowded road, up that tree and down again, his heart was beating her name. Betty, Betty, Betty. What a blind fool he had been not to see it before. She, too, had been blind. It was all clear now, this mysterious power that had called them from the first, neither of them knowing or understanding. When Betty took his note from the maid's hand, her eyes could see nothing for a moment. She turned away that Peggy should not catch her white face. She knew instinctively the message was from John Vaughn. It may have been written with his last breath and sent by a friend. She broke the seal with slow, nervous dread, looked quickly and laughed aloud when she had read it. A joyous, half-hysterical little laugh. The man's waiting for an answer, miss, the maid said. Betty looked at her stupidly and blushed. Why, of course, Peggy. In a moment, tell him. She wrote half a page in fervent haste, telling him how happy she was to know that he had safely returned and read it over twice, flushed with anger at her silly confusion, tore it into tiny bits. She tried again, but afraid to trust herself, spread John's note out and used it for a model. My dear Mr. Vaughn, certainly, as soon as you can call. Betty Winter. And then she sat down by her window and listened to the splash of the rain against the glass, counting the minutes until he should ring her doorbell. When at last he came, she had to stand before her clock and count the seconds off for 5 minutes, lest she should disgrace herself by rushing down the stairs. Their hands met in a moment of awkward silence, the play of mind on mind, its set each heart pounding. The man of easy speech found for the first time that words were difficult. You've heard the black news, of course, he stammered. Yes. His eyes caught the haggard, drawn look of his face with a start. You saw it all? She asked. I saw much that I can never hope to forget it, he answered bitterly. He led her to a seat, and she, flushed with the sudden realization that he had been holding her hand since the moment they met. She drew it away with a quick, nervous moment and sat down abruptly. Was it really as bad as it looks today? She asked, with an attempt at conventional tones. Worse, Miss Betty, you can't imagine the shame of it all. I was never in battle before. I wouldn't mind repeating that experience at close quarters, but the panic. The president is the coolest and most courageous man in the country today. She put it eagerly. It's inspiring to talk to him. A bitter speech against a commander-in-chief who could allow himself to be driven into battle by the chatter of fools rose to his lips, but he remembered her admiration and was silent. He fumbled at his watch chain and pulled the corner of his black mustache with growing embarrassment. The thing was more difficult than he had dreamed. I've resigned from the paper, he said at last. Resigned? She replied mechanically. Yes, I'm going back home tonight and help raise a company in answer to the president's proclamation. The room was very still. Betty turned her eyes toward the window and listened to the splash of wind-driven rain. To your hometown? She faltered. Yes, to Palmyra, Missouri. Where your brother went to raise a company to fight us? Strange, isn't it? Her voice had a faraway sound as if she were talking to herself. Yes, to fight us, he repeated in low tones. Again a silence fell between them. He looked steadily into her brown eyes that were burning now with a strange intensity, tried to speak, and failed. He caught the gasp of terror in the deep breath with which she turned from his gaze. My chief was bitter against my going. I hope you approve, Miss Betty. He spoke with pauses which betrayed his excitement. Yes, I'm glad. She stopped short, turned pale, and fumbled at the lace handkerchief she carried. Every brave man who loves the Union must feel as you do today, and go, no matter how hard it may be for those he leaves at home. She paused in embarrassment at the break she had almost made and flushed scarlet. He leaned close. I'm afraid I'm not brave, Miss Betty. I ran with the rest of them yesterday, ran like a dog for my life. He paused and caught his breath, but I'm not sorry for it now. In the madness of that scramble to save my skin, I had a sudden revelation of why life was sweet. He stopped and she scarcely breathed. Her heart seemed to cease beating. Her dry lips refused to speak the question she now would ask. The sweet moment of pain and of glory had come. She felt his trembling hand seize her ice-cold fingers as he went on impetuously. Life was sweet because I love you, Betty. She sprang to her feet, trembling from head to foot. He followed, whispering, My own, I love you, I love you. With sudden fierce strength, he clasped her in his arms and covered her lips with kisses. She lifted her trembling hands. Please, please. Again he smothered her words and held her in mad close embrace. Let me go! Let me go! She cried with sudden fury, thrusting him from her, breathless, her eyes blinded with tears. Tell me that you love me, he cried with desperate pleading. The splendid young figure faced him, tense, quivering with rage. How dare you take me into your arms like that without a word? Her eyes were flashing, her breast rising and falling with quick, furious breathing. He seized her hand and held it with cruel force. Her eyes blazed, and he dropped it. She was thinking of the scene with his slender, chivalrous brother. She could feel the soft kiss on the tips of her finger, and the blood surged to her face at the thought of this man's lips pressed on her in mad, strangling passion, without so much as, by your leave, she could tear his eyes out. He looked at her now in a hopeless stupor of regret. Forgive me, Betty, he faltered. I couldn't help it. Her eyes held this in a cold stare. I suppose that's all any woman has ever meant to you, and you took this for granted. He lifted his hand in protest. Please, please, Miss Betty. You may go now, she said with slow emphasis. He looked at her a moment dazed, and a wave of sullen anger slowly mounted his face to the roots of his black tangled hair, which he suddenly brushed from his forehead. Without a word, he walked out into the storm, his jaws set. The door had scarcely closed when the trembling figure crumpled on a lounge in a flood of bitter tears. Chapter 11 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 11, The Man on Horseback. Before the sun had set on the day of the storm which had followed the panic at Bull Run, the President had selected and summoned to Washington the man who was to create the first grand army of the Republic, a man destined to measure the full power of his personality against the chief magistrate in a desperate struggle for supremacy in the life of the nation itself, General George Brinton McClellan. In answer to the summons, reached Washington on July 20th and immediately took command of the Army of the Potomac, or what was left of it. The President did not make this selection without bitter opposition and grave warning. He was told that McClellan was an aggressive pro-slavery Democrat, a political meddler, and unalterably opposed to him and his party on every essential issue before the people. Those arguments found no weight with the man in the White House. He would ask but one question, discuss but one issue. Is McClellan the man to whip this new army of 500,000 citizens into a mighty fighting machine and level it against the Confederacy? The all but unanimous answer was yes. Then I'll appoint him, was his firm reply. I don't care what his religion is or his politics. The question is not whether I shall save the Union, but that the Union shall be saved. My future and the future of my party can take care of themselves. If they can't, then let them die. The new commander was a man of striking and charming personality, but 34 years old, and graduated from West Point in 1846. He had served with distinction in the war against Mexico, studied military science in Europe under the great generals in command of the siege of Sebastopol, and achieved in West Virginia the first success won in the struggle with the South. He had been opposed in West Virginia by General Robert E. Lee, the man of destiny, to whom the President, through General Scott, had offered the command of the Union Army before Lee had drawn his sword for Virginia. He was a past master of the technical science of engineering, defense, and military drill. In spite of his short physical stature, he was a commanding appearance. On horseback, the figure was impressively heroic. It took no second glance to see that General McClellan was a born leader of men. On the first day of his active command, he had already conceived the idea that he was a man of destiny. He wrote that night to his wife, I find myself in a new and strange position here, President, Cabinet, General Scott, and all deferring to me. By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land. 3 days later, he wrote again of his sensational reception in the Senate chamber. I suppose half a dozen of the oldest members made the remark, I am becoming so much used to. Why, how young you look, and yet an old soldier. They gave me my way in everything, full swing and unbounded confidence. All tell me that I am held responsible for the fate of the nation, and that all its resources shall be placed at my disposal. It is an immense task that I have on my hands, but I believe I can accomplish it. When I was in the Senate chamber today and found those old men flocking around me, when I afterwards stood in the library, looking over the capital of a great nation and saw the crowd gathering to stare at me, I began to feel how great the task committed to me, how sincerely I pray God that I may be endowed with the wisdom and courage necessary to accomplish this work. Who would have thought when we were married that I should so soon be called upon to save my country? Nor was McClellan the only man who saw this startling vision. He made friends with astounding rapidity, and held men to him with the hooks of steel. With utter indifference to his own fame or future, the President joined the public in praise of the coming star. The big heart at the White House rejoiced in the strength of his commanding general, but the man who measured the world by fixed standards of an exact science had no power of adjustments to the homely manners, simple, unconventional ways, and whimsical moods of Abraham Lincoln. McClellan's one answer to all inquiries about his relation to the chief executive was, the President is honest and means well. The smile that played about the corners of his fine, keen blue eyes when he said this left no doubt in the mind of his hearer as to his real opinion of the poor country lawyer who had by accident been placed in the White House. And so the inevitable happened. The suggestions of the president and his War Department were early resented as meddling with affairs which did not concern them. The president saw with keen sorrow that there were brewing schemes behind the compelling blue eyes of the Napoleon he had created. The talk of McClellan's aspirations to a military dictatorship, which would include the authority of the executive and legislative branches of government, had been current for more than 2 months. His recent manner and bearing had given color to these reports. The splendor and ceremony of his headquarters could not have been surpassed by Alexander and Napoleon. His growing staff already included a prince of royal blood, the distinguished son of the Emperor of France, and the Comte de Paris, his attendant. His baggage train was drawn by 100 magnificent horses, perfectly matched, hitched in teams of 4 to 25 glittering new vans. McClellan's grand army spread over mile after mile of territory, far back into the hills of Virginia. The days of autumn were brilliant with fresh uniforms, stars, sabers, swords, spurs, plate, dinners, wine, cigars, the pomp and pride and glory of war. Men stood in little groups and discussed in whispers the significance of his continued stay in the capital. If the president has any friends, the hour's come when they've got to stand by him. The speaker was a man of 50, a foreigner who had made Washington his home and liked Lincoln. "Nonsense, my dear fellow," a tall Westerner replied. "We may have to get a few rifles and guard the White House from somebody's attempt to occupy it, but we'll not need any big guns. If you'd have heard the talk last night," the foreigner replied with a shrug of his shoulder, "you'd change your mind." The Westerner shook his head. "No." The general's not that big of a fool, and the men around him have better sense. And if they haven't, if they all should go crazy, it couldn't be done. They couldn't control the army. Did you ever hear the army cheer as little Mac rides along the lines? Yes, but it doesn't mean an emperor for all that. I'm not so sure. And there were men of national reputation who considered the chances of the man on horseback good at this moment. Such a man had openly attached himself to the general as his attorney, no less a personage than the distinguished Attorney General of the late Cabinet, Edwin M. Stanton. During the closing days of Buchanan's crumbling administration, Stanton had become the dominating force of the capital. His daring and his skill had defeated the best-laid schemes of the Southern party and broken its grip on the administration. He had remained in Washington as a lawyer, practicing before the Supreme Court, and had become the most aggressive observer and critic of Lincoln and his cabinet. His scorn for the president knew no bounds. "No one," he wrote to General John A. Dix, "can imagine the deplorable condition of this city and the hazard of government who did not witness the weakness and panic of the administration and the painful imbecility of Lincoln." To Buchanan, his ex-chief wrote, "A strong feeling of distrust in the candor and sincerity of Lincoln's personality and of his cabinet has sprung up. It was the imbecility of this administration which culminated in the catastrophe of Bull Run. Irretrievable misfortune and national disgrace, never to be forgotten, are to be added to the ruin of all peaceful pursuits, and national bankruptcy as a result of Lincoln's running the machine for 5 months. Jefferson Davis will soon be in possession of Washington." Not only in letters to the leaders of public opinion in the nation did the aggressive and powerful lawyer seek to destroy the government, but in his conversation in Washington, he was equally daring, venomous, and personal in his abuse of the president. "A low, cunning clown," and "the original gorilla" were his choice epitaphs. Stanton's influence over McClellan was decided and vital from the moment of their introduction. It was known among the general's intimate friends that he had advised again and again to use his power as commander of the army to declare a dictatorship, depose the president, and dissolve the sittings of Congress until war should be ended. How far McClellan had dallied with this dangerous and alluring scheme was a matter of conjecture. It is little wonder that the wildest rumors of intrigues, of uprisings, of mutiny filled the air. McClellan had doggedly refused to either move his army or to formally go into winter quarters until the middle of December, when he took to his bed and announced that he was suffering from an attack of typhoid fever. President Lincoln was further embarrassed by the course of his Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who, while laboring under the censure of Congress for the conduct of his office, had allowed Senator Winter to stab his chief in the back by recommending in his report that the slaves be armed by the government and put into the ranks of the armies. Senator Winter, as a radical leader, knew that to meet such an issue once raised, the president must rebuke his secretary and apologize to the border slave states. He would thus alienate from his support of all Cameron's friends and all friends of the Negro. The senator did not believe the president would dare to fight on such an issue. He had misjudged the man. The president not only rebuked his secretary by suppressing the report and revising its language, he demanded and received his resignation, notwithstanding the fact that Cameron was the most powerful politician in the most powerful state of the North. He at once sought a new Secretary of War, free from all party entanglements, who could not be influenced by contractors or jobbers or scheming politicians, who was absolutely honest and who had a boundless capacity for work. Strangely enough, his eyes rested on Edwin M. Stanton, his archenemy, the man who had become McClellan's confidential attorney. As an aggressive, patriotic Democrat, Stanton won the confidence of the public in the last administration. His capacity for work had proved limitless. He was under no obligation to a living soul who could ask aught of Lincoln's administration. He was savagely honest. At the moment, the discovery of gigantic frauds practiced on the War Department by thieving contractors, coupled with fabulous expenditures and daily expenses, had destroyed the confidence of the moneylenders in the integrity of the United States government. The Treasury was facing a serious crisis. And then the astounding thing happened. Without consulting a soul inside his cabinet, Abraham Lincoln appointed his bitterest foe from the party of his enemies the Secretary of War. He offered the place to Edwin M. Stanton. Perhaps the most astonished man in America was Stanton himself. To the amazement of his friends as well as his critics, he promptly accepted the position. Senator Winter, whose radical temperament had found in Stanton a congenial spirit, though as wide as the poles apart in politics, met him in the lobby of the Senate chamber on the day his appointment was confirmed. He broke into a cynical laugh and asked, "And what will you do?" Stanton's keen eyes bored right through him in silence as he snapped, "I may make Abraham Lincoln President of the United States." Evidently another man was entering the cabinet under the impression that the hands of an impotent chief magistrate needed strengthening. The merest glance at the man's burly, thick, set body, his big leonine head with a shock of heavy black hair, long and curling, his huge grizzly beard and full resolute lips, was enough to convince the most casual observer that he could be a dangerous enemy or a powerful ally. The president was warned of this appointment, but his confidence was unshaking. His reply was a revelation of personality. "I have faith in affirmative men like Stanton. They stand between a nation and perdition. He has shown a loyalty to the Union that rose above his own partisan creed of a lifetime. I like that kind of man." "He'll run away with the whole concern," was his friend's laconic reply. The president's big, generous mouth moved with a smile. "Well, you may have to treat him as they sometimes did a Methodist minister I knew out west. He was a mighty man in prayer and exhortation. At times his excitement rose to such threatening heights, the elders put brickbats in his pockets to hold him down. We may be obliged to serve Stanton the same way." He paused and laughed. "But I guess we'll let him jump a while first." The men who knew the inner secrets of Stanton's relations to McClellan watched this drama with keen interest. Had he gone into the cabinet to place the general in supreme power of a moment of crisis, or had he, at heart, deserted the commander with his intention of using the enormous power of the War Department to further a scheme of equal daring for himself? They could only watch the swiftly moving scenes of the war pageant for their answer. One fact was standing out each day with sharp and clean-cut distinctness. The struggle of giants was on beneath the surface. Startling surprise had followed startling surprise during the past month. Men everywhere were asking one another, "What's next?" The air of Washington was foul with the breath of passion and intrigue. Purposes and methods were everywhere assailed. Men high in civil life were believed to be plotting with military conspirators to advance their personal fortunes on the ruins of the Republic. Around 2 men were gathering the forces whose clash would decide the destiny of the nation, the struggle between the supremacy of civil authority and the president, and the war-created strength of the military commander represented by General McClellan. Could the Republic survive this war within a war? End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 12, Love and Pride. Betty Winter had found her fierce resolution to blot John Vaughan from her life a difficult one to keep. The first 2 weeks were not so hard. Every instinct of her pure young girlhood had cried out against the conceit which had imagined her conquest so easy. The memory of his arms around her, crushing with cruel force his hot lips on hers in mad, unasked kisses, brought the angry blood mounting to her cheeks. She walked the floor in rage and dropped at last exhausted. I could kill him. The memory which stung deepest was the terror she had felt in his arms, the sudden fear of the brute, quivering in tense muscles and throbbing in passionate kisses. She had thought this man a gentleman. In that flash of self-revealing, he was simply a beast. It had unsettled her whole attitude toward life. For the first time, she began to suspect the darker side of passion. If this were love, she would have none of it. Again, she resolved for the 100th time to banish the last thought of him. If there were no cleaner, more chivalrous men in the world, she could live without them. But there were men with holier ideals. Ned Vaughan was one. She drew from the drawer the only letter she had received from him, and the last she would probably get many a day, as he had crossed the dead line of war and was now somewhere in the great silent South. She read it over and over with tender smiles. Dear Miss Betty, I can't disappear behind the battle lines without a last word to you. I just wanted to tell you that every hour, waking or dreaming in the memory of you, is my inspiration. The hardest task is easy because my heart is beating with your name on every stroke. For me, the drums throb it, the bugle calls it. I hear it in the tramp of soldiers, the rumble of a gun, and the beat of horses' hooves, and the rattle of the saber. For I am fighting my way back, inch by inch, hour by hour, to you, my love. You cannot answer this. There will be no more mail from the South, no more mail from the North, until I see you again on Capitol Hill in Washington. There has never been a doubt in my heart that the South shall win, that I shall win. And when I stand before you then, it will not be as a conqueror, though victorious. I shall bow at your feet, your willing slave, and I shall kiss my chains, because your dear hands have made them. I can expect no answer to this. I ask none, I need none. My love is enough. It is so big and wonderful it makes the world glorious. Signed, Ned. How sharp and bitter the contrast between the soul of this chivalrous boy and his vain, conceited brother. She loathed herself for her blind stupidity. Why had she preferred him? Why? The very question had cut her. It was not because John Vaughan had chosen to cast his lot with the people of the North. Rubbish. She had a sneaking admiration for Ned because he had dared her displeasure in making his choice. There must be something perverse in her somewhere. She could see it now. It must be so, or the evil in John Vaughan's character would not have drawn her in as a magnet from the first. She hadn't a doubt now that all the stories about his fast life and contempt for women were true, and much more than gossip had dreamed. He would write a letter of apology, of course, in due season. He was too shrewd a man of the world, too skillful an interpreter of the whims of women to write at once. He was waiting for her to cool, waiting until she should begin to be anxious. It was too transparent. She would give him a surprise when his letter came. The shock would take a little of the conceit out of him. She would return his letter unopened by the next mail. When 4 weeks passed without a word, the first skirmish between love and pride began. Perhaps she'd been unreasonable after all. Was it right to blame a man so harshly for being mad and the woman he loved? In her heart of hearts, Did she desire any other sort of lover? Tears of vexation came in spite of every effort to maintain her high position. She had to face the plain truth. She didn't desire a cold lover. She wished him to be strong, manly, masterful. Yes, masterful, that was it, and yet infinitely tender. This man was simply a brute. And yet the memory of his mad embrace, the blind violence of his kisses, had become each day more vivid and terrible. Terrible because of their fascination. She accepted the fact at last in a burst of bitter tears. And then came the announcement in the Daily Republican of his return to the city and his attachment to the company of cavalry at McClellan's headquarters. The thought of his presence sent the blood surging in scarlet waves to her face. There was no longer any question in her mind that she had wounded him too deeply for forgiveness. Her dismissal had been so cold, so curt, it had been an accusation of dishonor. She could see it clearly now. He had poured out in his confession of utter love in a torrent of mad words and clasped in her arms, without thought or calculation, an act of instinctive resistless impulse. He had justly resented the manner in which she had repulsed him, yet she had simply followed the impulse of her girlish heart. She would die sooner than apologize. She accepted the situation at last with a dull sense of pain and despair, and tried to find consolation in devotion to work in the hospitals, which had begun to grow around the army of drilling volunteers. Events were moving now with swift march, and her championship of the president gave her days of excitement, which brought unexpected relief from her gloomy thoughts. She was witnessing the first movements of this national drama from the inside, and its passion had stirred her imagination. Her father's growing hatred of Abraham Lincoln left her in no doubt as to whose master hand had guided the assaults on the rear of his distracted administration. The fall of Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War, had been the work of her father, with scarcely a suggestion from without. The abolitionists had determined to force Lincoln to free the slaves at once, or to destroy him and his administration. There were also whispering the name of their chosen dictator who would assume the reins of power on his downfall. The president was equally clear in his demonstration not to allow his hand to be forced and lose control of the border slave states, whose influence and power were becoming each day more and more essential to the preservation of the Union. He has succeeded in separating the counties of Western Virginia and had created a new state out of them. His policy of conciliation and forbearance was slowly but surely welding Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland to the nation. Any tinkering at this moment with the question of slavery would imperil the loyalty of these four states. He held them now, and he refused to listen to any man or faction who asked him to loosen that grip. The true policy of the radicals, Senator Winter realized, was to fire into the president's back through his generals on the field into an emancipation crusade, which would work the North into a frenzy of passion. He had shrewdly calculated the chances, and he did not believe that Lincoln would dare risk his career on a direct order revoking such a proclamation. General Hunter was the first to accept this mutinous scheme. He issued a proclamation declaring all slaves within the lines of the Union Army forever free, and a wave of passionate excitement swept the North. The quiet, self-contained man in the White House did not wait to calculate the force of this storm. He revoked Hunter's order before the ink was dry on it. Again, Senator Winter invaded the executive office. "You die, sir," he thundered, "to thus spit in the face of millions of the loyal North, who are pouring their blood and treasure into this war." "I do," was the even answer. "I am President of the United States, and as Commander-in-Chief of its Army and Navy, I will not be disobeyed by my subordinates on an issue I deem vital to the nation's existence. If in the fullness of God's time an Emancipation Proclamation must be issued in order to save the Union, I know my duty, and I'll do it without the interference of any of my generals in the field." He paused and glanced over the rims of his spectacles with a sudden flash from his deep-set eyes. "Do I make myself clear?" Winter's face went white with anger as he slowly answered, "Perfectly. It seems that you have learned nothing from the wrath with which your sacrifice of John C. Fremont to appease the slave power was received." "So it seems," was the laconic response. Fremont issued, without consulting me, his famous proclamation last August. I saw your hand, Senator, in that clause freeing the slaves in the state of Missouri, and I warn you, the senator growled, that the storm of this indignation which met that act was nothing to the one that will break about your head tomorrow. The curses of Fremont's soldiers still ring in your ears. The press, the pulpit, the platform, and both houses of Congress gave you a taste of their scorn. You will not soon forget. Thousands of sober citizens who have given you their support, whose votes put you into this office, tore down your picture from their walls and trampled it under their feet. For the first time in the history of this republic, the effigy of a living president was burned publicly in the streets of an American city, amid the jeers and curses of men who had elected him. Your sacrifice of Fremont has made him the idol of the West. He is to them today what Napoleon was in exile to France. This is a government of the people. Even a president may go too far in daring to override public opinion. The giant figure slowly rose and faced his opponent, erect, controlled, dignified. But the question is, Senator, who is a better judge of true public opinion, you or I? It remains to be seen. In the meantime, I must tell you once more that I am not the representative of a clique or a faction. I am the chief magistrate of all the people. I'm going to save this union for them and their children. I hope to live to see the death of slavery. That is in God's hands. My duty today is as clear as the noonday sun. I can't lose the border slave states at this stage of the game and save the Union. Therefore, I must hold them at all hazards. Let the heathen rage, and the people imagine vain things if they will. Then it's a waste of breath to talk, the senator suddenly shouted. The rugged head bowed gracefully. I thought so from the first, but I've tried to be polite. Good day, sir. Good day, Senator, the president laughed. Come in any time you want to let off some steam. I'll make you feel easier. It won't hurt me. Abraham Lincoln knew the real cause of the public irritation and the loss of confidence. The outburst of wrath over Fremont was but a symptom. The disease lay deeper. The people had lost confidence in his War Department through the failure of his first secretary and the inactivity of the Army under General McClellan. He had applied the remedy to the first cause in the dismissal of Cameron and the appointment of Edwin Stanton. It remained to be seen whether he could control his commanding general, or whether McClellan would control the government. The situation was an intolerable one, not only to the people, who were sacrificing their blood and money, but to his own inherent sense of honor and dignity. He had no right to organize and drill a mighty army to go into winter quarters, drink and play cards, and dance while a victorious foe flaunted their flag within sight of the capital. Besides, the Western Division under two obscure generals, Grant and Sherman, had moved in force in midwinter and with a mere handful of men. Compared to the hosts encamped at Washington, had captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and had taken 14,000 prisoners. The Navy had brilliantly cooperated on the river, and this fact only made more painful the disgrace of the Confederate blockade of the capital by its half a dozen batteries on the banks of the Potomac. The president was compelled to test the ugly question of the extent and power of General McClellan's personal support. He returned from a tour of inspection and stood on the hilltop overlooking McClellan's miles of tents and curling campfires. He turned to Mrs. Lincoln, who had accompanied him. You know what that is? The Army of the Potomac, of course, Father. No, he replied bitterly. That's only McClellan's bodyguard, 180,000. The general had persisted and refused to take any suggestions from his superior as to the movement of his army. Would Lincoln dare to force the issue between them and risk the mutiny of his grand army, undoubtedly devoted to their brilliant young leader? There were many who believed that if he dared, the result would be a coup d'etat, which would place the man on horseback in supreme power. The moment the president reached the point where he saw that further delay would mean grave peril to the nation, he acted with a promptness which stunned the glittering military court over which the young Napoleon presided. From the White House, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, he issued a military order for the advance of McClellan's forces onto Richmond. The idea of such an order coming from a backwoods lawyer without military training was preposterous. Its audacity for a moment stunned the commander of all the divisions of the Army. But when the excitement had subsided on the day it was done, General McClellan, for the first time, squarely faced the fact that there was a real man in the White House. The issue was a square one. He must obey that order or march on the Capitol with his army, depose the president, and declare a dictatorship. He decided to move on Richmond. He wrangled over the route he would take, but he moved, when once in motion, with remarkable swiftness. Within 2 weeks, a magnificent army of 120,000 men, 14,000 horses, 44 batteries with endless trains of wagons, supplies, and pontoon bridges were transported by water 200 miles to the Virginia Peninsula without the loss of life. The day was a glorious one toward the end of March when Betty stood on the hill above Alexandria and watched with heavy heart the magnificent pageant of the embarking army. That spring was unusually early. The grass was already a rich green carpet in the shaded lanes. Jonquils were flaming from every walkway. The violets began to lift their blue heads from the dark green leaves, and the trees overhead were hanging with tassels, behind which showed the clusters of fresh buds bursting into leaf. The armed host covered hill and plain and stretched out in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 400 ships had moved up the river to receive them. Companies and regiments of magnificently equipped soldiers were marching to the throb of drum and the scream of fife. Thousands of cavalrymen in gay uniforms, their golden yellows shining in the sun, were dashing across the meadow at the foot of the hill. The long lines of infantry stretched down from the hills through the streets of Alexandria down to the water's edge. Everywhere the regimental bands were playing martial music. Suddenly, among those marching, cheering, laughing, shouting thousands was the man she loved, leaving without a word. An awkward private soldier passed on with his arm around his sweetheart. Her eyes were red and she leaned close. They were not talking anymore, but a few minutes were left, and he must go, perhaps to die. Words had ceased to mean anything. Her heart rose in fierce rebellion against the wall of silence her pride had reared. A group of magnificently equipped young officers passed on horseback, perhaps of General McClellan's staff. She looked in vain among them for a familiar face. If he passed, she would disgrace herself. She felt it with increasing certainty. Why had she come here anyway? As well, to tell the truth, in vague hope of a meeting. The quick beat of a horse echoed along the road. She looked and recognized John Vaughan. He was coming straight toward her. Instinctively and resistlessly, she moved forward to meet him. She waved her hand in an awkward little gesture as she had tried to stop after beginning a movement. His eye had been quick to see, and with a graceful pull on the horse's bridle, he had touched the pommel of his saddle, leaped to his feet, cap in hand, and stood trembling before her. "It's good, too good to be true," he exclaimed breathlessly. She extended her bare hand and held it without protest. It was trembling violently. "You are going to leave without an effort to see me?" she asked in low tones. "I was just debating that problem when I saw you standing by the road," he answered soberly. "I don't think I could have done it. It's several hours before we embark. I was just figuring on how I could reach you in time." "Really?" she murmured. "Honestly." "Well, if you had gone without a word, I couldn't have blamed you." She paused and bit her lips. "I was very foolish that day." "It was my fault," he broke in. "All my fault. I was a brute. I realized it too late. I had eaten my pride and had gone back to see you the day I reached Washington, if I had thought it any use. I have never seen a look in the eyes of a woman as you gave me that day, Miss Betty. If there had been any love in your heart, I knew I'd killed it." She looked into his eyes with a tender smile. "I thought you had." He pressed her hand tenderly. "But now, I know that love can't be killed by a kiss." She stopped suddenly, threw her arms around his neck, and kissed him. He held her close for a moment, murmuring, "My sweetheart, my darling." Through 4 swift, beautiful hours they sat on a log and held each other's hands and told over and over the sweet story. Another long, tender embrace, and he was gone. She stood on the little wharf among hundreds of weeping sisters, mothers, and sweethearts, and watched his boat drift down the river. He waved his hand to her until the big, unfinished dome of the Capitol began to fade on the distant horizon. End of chapter 12.